They sold her to save the family. They forgot to ask whether the Duke wanted a bride or a witness. The first time Rosalind Evercott heard the name Thaddeus Ashbourne spoken aloud, it was whispered the same way people whispered about shipwrecks and winter plagues. Quietly, fearfully, like saying it too loudly might invite disaster into the room. She was 19 years old when her aunt sold her to him for the price of a dying family name and $47,000 in inherited debt. The contract was signed before she even entered the library. Rain hammered against the tall windows of Evercott House while the fire struggled to stay alive in the marble hearth. Everything smelled damp. Damp wood. Damp velvet. Damp ruin. Rosalind stood outside the cracked door with one gloved hand clenched around the silver tray she had been carrying moments earlier. Tea trembled inside the porcelain cups. She could hear voices inside. Low, sharp, tense. "You promised the creditors another extension," Aunt Lenora hissed. "They are done waiting." "I know that." Uncle Bernard sounded exhausted. "God help me, Lenora, I know." "Then we have no choice." Pause followed. The kind that changed lives. Rosalind should have walked away. She knew that now. But then her own name drifted through the door like smoke. "Ashbourne will clear everything," Lenora whispered. "Every debt. Every mortgage. Every note your idiot brother left behind." Silence. Then Bernard spoke again, quieter this time. "And the girl." Rosalind stopped breathing. "The Duke asked for a wife." The tray nearly slipped from her hands. Porcelain rattled softly together. Inside the library, no one spoke for several seconds. Then came the scrape of a chair. Footsteps approached the door. Rosalind stepped backward instinctively just as Aunt Lenora opened it. Her aunt wore dark green silk despite the early hour. Emeralds glittered at her throat. She looked elegant in the same cruel way sharpened knives looked elegant. Her eyes moved immediately to Rosalind's face. There was no guilt there, only calculation. "How long have you been standing here?" Rosalind swallowed carefully. "Long enough." Lenora stared at her for a moment. Then she sighed as though inconvenience offended her more than morality ever could. "Come inside." Rosalind obeyed because girls raised in collapsing aristocratic families learned obedience before they learned survival. The library looked colder than the hallway somehow. Uncle Bernard sat near the fire with both hands pressed against his temples. Papers covered the desk beside him. Bills, contracts, final notices stamped in red ink. Rosalind recognized her father's handwriting on one of them and immediately looked away. Her father had been dead 11 months. Fever took him in less than 4 days. Debt survived him beautifully. "Sit down," Lenora said. Rosalind remained standing. "I would rather stand." Her aunt's expression tightened slightly. "Fine. Then let us not waste time pretending you have options." There it was. The truth. Clean and ugly. Bernard finally looked up at her. His eyes were bloodshot. "Rosalind." He sounded ashamed. That almost made it worse. "The estate is gone," he said softly. "We cannot hold it any longer." "I know. The banks are taking the South property next week." "I know." "Then you understand why this marriage must happen." Rosalind looked at him for a long moment. "No," she said quietly. "I understand why you want it to happen. That is not the same thing." Rain cracked hard against the windows. Somewhere upstairs, water dripped steadily through the ceiling into a bucket that had been sitting beneath the leak since October. Nobody fixed anything anymore. Evercott House had been dying room by room for years. Lenora crossed her arms. "Duke Ashbourne is offering salvation." Rosalind almost laughed. Salvation. People did not describe Thaddeus Ashbourne with words like salvation. They described him with words like ruthless, untouchable, buried alive in the north with his dead wife's ghost wandering the halls. "He is almost 50, Rosalind said. 47, Lenora corrected sharply. "And one of the wealthiest men in the country. His first wife died. Women die every day." Rosalind felt something cold move slowly down her spine. People say terrible things about Ashbourne Manor. People say terrible things about every powerful man. Lenora stepped closer. "Listen to me carefully. If this marriage does not happen, this family collapses completely. We lose the house, the staff, everything. And what do I lose?" Lenora did not answer immediately. That silence told Rosalind enough. Bernard stood suddenly and walked toward the window. His shoulders looked smaller than she remembered from childhood. The Duke specifically requested a quiet bride, he murmured. Someone untouched by scandal. Someone desperate enough not to refuse, Rosalind said. Neither of them denied it. The clock above the fireplace chimed 4 times. Outside, thunder rolled across the dark hills surrounding the estate. Rosalind stared at the marriage contract resting on the desk. Her name had already been written beautifully across the bottom line. Rosalind Eleanor Evercott. Her father used to say her name sounded like poetry. Now it looked like a receipt. When? She asked. Lenora exhaled softly in relief. Tomorrow night. Rosalind looked up sharply. Tomorrow. The Duke is arriving personally. Personally. Even Lenora seemed unsettled by that. His secretary informed us His Grace prefers efficiency. Efficiency. As though she were livestock being transported before winter weather worsened. Rosalind moved toward the desk slowly. Her reflection shimmered faintly across the dark wood surface. Pale gold hair pinned carefully beneath mourning ribbons. Blue-gray eyes shadowed from too many sleepless nights. A face still soft with youth despite the exhaustion pulling at it constantly now. She looked fragile. She hated that she looked fragile. Do I get to meet him before signing my life away? Lenora's lips thinned. You should be grateful a man like Ashbourne is willing to overlook your circumstances. Rosalind looked directly at her aunt. And what exactly are my circumstances? That landed harder than Lenora expected. Good. For one brief second, discomfort flickered across the older woman's face before disappearing beneath practiced composure. Your circumstances, Lenora said coldly, are poverty. Bernard closed his eyes. Rosalind felt strangely calm after that. Not numb. Worse, clear. There was a kind of clarity that arrived only after hope finally died. She placed the untouched tea tray onto a nearby table with careful hands. What happens if I refuse? Bernard answered this time. The creditors come Monday. Rosalind nodded once. Of course they did. She turned toward the door without another word. Rosalind, Lenora called after her. She stopped but did not look back. Ashbourne is old, her aunt said quietly. Men like him do not live forever. You may end up very comfortable. Rosalind almost smiled then. Not because anything was funny, because that was the cruelest part of all. Lenora truly believed comfort could replace freedom. Upstairs, Rosalind packed alone while the storm deepened outside. Her bedroom had once belonged to her mother. Faded roses still curled along the wallpaper. One corner of the ceiling carried water stains shaped vaguely like spreading wings. She folded dresses carefully into the small trunk resting open on the bed. There was not much left worth taking. Most jewelry had already been sold months ago. Her mother's piano disappeared in September. The horses in November. Even the silver dining set vanished before Christmas. Poverty arrived politely at first. Then all at once. Rosalind paused beside the vanity mirror. For a moment she studied herself silently. 19 years old. Sold to a man old enough to remember her mother as a child. Somewhere downstairs servants whispered already. She could almost hear them. The old Duke is coming. The black carriage. The northern widower. Girls like Rosalind grew up hearing stories about powerful men. None of the stories ended kindly. A knock sounded softly at her bedroom door. Miss Rosalind? Clara, the youngest housemaid, stepped inside carrying folded linens. Her cheeks were flushed pink from nerves. Mrs. Evercott asked me to help you pack. Rosalind nodded once. Thank you. Clara hesitated awkwardly while placing the linens into the trunk. Finally she whispered, Is it true? Rosalind knew exactly what she meant. Yes. Clara looked horrified. They say Ashbourne Manor has 60 rooms and no laughter in any of them. Rosalind stared down at the gloves in her hands. Then perhaps I shall not feel out of place there. The maid looked close to tears after that. Rosalind regretted the remark immediately. I am sorry, she said gently. You do not need to pity me. But Clara did pity her. Everyone did. That was the unbearable part. By nightfall the storm had become vicious. Wind rattled the old windows hard enough to shake the glass. Rosalind could not sleep. She sat beside the candlelit window wrapped in a wool shawl while darkness swallowed the estate outside. Around midnight she heard it. Hooves, heavy, slow, deliberate. Her heartbeat stumbled painfully once. Rosalind rose immediately and crossed toward the window. Through the rain and darkness, she saw black horses emerging through the iron gates below. 4 of them, massive creatures cutting through the storm like shadows. Behind them rolled a long black carriage trimmed in silver. No crest marked the doors. It did not need one. Every servant in the house already knew who had arrived. Candlelights flickered awake downstairs one by one. Doors opened. Figures hurried across the front hall. Rosalind remained frozen beside the glass while the carriage stopped directly before the entrance steps. For several seconds nothing happened. Then the carriage door opened slowly. A man stepped out into the rain. Tall, broad-shouldered beneath a black wool coat darkened further by the storm. He did not hurry despite the weather. Did not flinch beneath the cold rain striking his face. One gloved hand rested briefly atop a silver-headed cane before he straightened fully. Even from the second-floor window Rosalind could feel it. The stillness, the weight of him. Men like Thaddeus Ashbourne did not enter rooms. They arrived like judgment. Lightning flashed across the estate grounds, illuminating his face for one sharp second. Silver at the temples, hard jaw, eyes darker than midnight beneath the storm. Not handsome in the soft romantic way young girls dreamed about. Worse, dangerous. Alive in a way that made everyone around him seem smaller. The front doors opened below. Servants bowed immediately. Nobody spoke. Ashbourne handed his gloves to one of the footmen without looking at him. Then slowly, deliberately, the Duke lifted his gaze upward toward the second-floor windows. Toward her. Rosalind stopped breathing completely. Across rain and darkness and 2 stories of empty air, she knew with terrifying certainty that he had found her window immediately. Not searching, knowing. The candle beside her flickered weakly as his eyes locked onto hers through the storm. Then the Duke of Ashbourne smiled very slightly, and Rosalind understood for the first time that being sold was not the same thing as being chosen. Rosalind did not realize she had been holding her breath until the Duke disappeared beneath the stone archway of the entrance hall, and the candle beside her finally stopped trembling. Downstairs, the manor awakened all at once. Doors opened. Floorboards creaked. Servants rushed through corridors that had felt half-dead only an hour earlier. Even from the second floor she could hear the panic in their footsteps. Duke Thaddeus Ashbourne had arrived without warning in the middle of a storm. Men like him did not wait for invitations. A knock sounded sharply at her bedroom door. "Miss Rosalind," Clara whispered urgently from the other side. "Mrs. Evercott says you are to come downstairs immediately." Rosalind glanced once more toward the rain-covered window before answering. "I am coming." Her reflection followed her across the dark room as she moved toward the door. Pale face, nervous hands. The same girl she had been yesterday. Except yesterday she still belonged to herself. The hallways downstairs smelled of candle smoke and wet wool. Servants lined the walls trying not to stare openly as Rosalind descended the staircase. She could feel the tension hanging through the house like frost. One of the younger footmen crossed himself quietly when she passed. As though she were already walking toward a funeral. The entrance hall looked transformed. Firelight danced against polished marble. Rainwater glistened across the black floor tiles where Ashbourne's men had tracked in mud from outside. 3 large trunks rested near the doorway beside several leather cases marked with silver initials. Tia Rosalind stopped halfway down the staircase when she finally saw him clearly. Thaddeus Ashbourne stood near the fire with one hand resting lightly atop his cane while Uncle Bernard spoke to him in the strained voice of a man trying desperately not to offend someone far more dangerous than himself. The Duke did not appear tired despite the 4-hour journey through brutal weather. If anything, the storm seemed to belong to him somehow. Black wool coat, dark gloves, broad shoulders carrying the cold into the room with him. Up close, his age showed more clearly now. Silver threaded through dark hair near his temples. Fine lines marked the corners of his eyes. Not weakness, where, like stone weathered by too many winters, he turned before anyone announced her. Rosalind hated that her pulse reacted instantly. His gaze settled on her with unnerving precision. Calm, measuring. Not the hungry stare older men sometimes gave pretty girls at society dinners. Worse than that, intentional. The room fell completely silent. Even Aunt Lenora stopped pretending confidence for a moment beneath the weight of his attention. The Duke inclined his head slightly. "Miss Evercott." His voice sounded deeper indoors. Rough at the edges. Controlled. Rosalind descended the remaining stairs slowly because her knees suddenly felt unreliable beneath her skirts. "Your Grace." Ashbourne watched her approach without smiling. Not cold exactly. Something more difficult to read. As though he had already decided something privately and was waiting to see if she would disappoint him. Lenora recovered first. "Your Grace. What an honor to welcome you to Evercott House." Ashbourne did not look at her. "Is it?" The question landed softly. Somehow that made it sharper. Bernard cleared his throat nervously. "We did not expect you until tomorrow afternoon." "I changed my mind." Simple. Absolute. The Duke removed one glove slowly. Long fingers. Scar along the side of his hand disappearing beneath his sleeve. Rosalind noticed strange details when frightened. "The roads north will worsen by morning," he continued. "I prefer efficiency." Lenora forced a brittle smile. "Of course." Ashbourne's eyes returned to Rosalind. "You are colder than you should be." The observation startled her because it was true. She had been shivering for nearly 20 minutes. "I am fine," she said quietly. "No," the Duke replied. "You are trying not to appear afraid." Nobody in the room moved after that. Rosalind felt heat rise painfully into her face. Ashbourne studied her another second before removing his coat. One of the servants hurried forward automatically to take it, but the Duke ignored him entirely and instead stepped toward Rosalind. Every instinct told her to retreat. She did not. He draped the heavy black coat carefully around her shoulders himself. Warmth surrounded her instantly. The fabric smelled faintly of cedar smoke and winter air. "There," he said quietly. "That is better." Aunt Lenora looked stunned. Bernard looked confused. Rosalind looked up at the Duke in complete disbelief. Men like Thaddeus Ashbourne were not supposed to notice whether girls were cold. Ashbourne turned away from her then as though the moment meant nothing at all. "I would like the contracts finalized tonight." Lenora recovered quickly. "Certainly. We can prepare the library immediately." "No," the Duke's voice remained calm. "I do not sign business in front of an audience." Silence. Then his gaze moved toward Rosalind again. "Miss Evercott will join me instead." Lenora's mouth tightened. "Perhaps that is improper before the wedding." Improper. For the first time, something almost amused flickered across Ashbourne's face. "You sold your niece to a stranger during a thunderstorm. Let us not pretend propriety concerns you now." The room went dead quiet. Bernard stared at the floor. Lenora's face paled beneath her powder. Rosalind could not remember anyone ever speaking to her aunt that way and surviving socially afterward. Yet Ashbourne appeared entirely unconcerned. He rested one hand lightly against the silver head of his cane. 10 minutes, he said. Then send Miss Evercott to the West Library. He turned toward the corridor without waiting for agreement. 2 men who had entered with him earlier followed instantly behind. Guards, perhaps. Advisors. Rosalind could not tell. Ashbourne paused only once near the doorway. A sudden cough caught sharply in his chest. He reached for the wall briefly. Just briefly. But Rosalind saw it. Everyone did. The sound tore through the room with frightening force before he mastered it again almost immediately. One of his men stepped forward quickly. "Your Grace." "I am fine." The Duke straightened. Yet when he lowered the handkerchief from his mouth, Rosalind noticed the faintest trace of red against white linen before he folded it away. Her stomach tightened painfully. He was sick. Not rumor sick. Truly sick. Ashbourne saw her notice. For one strange suspended second, something unreadable passed between them. Not embarrassment. Not weakness. Warning. Then the Duke walked away into the shadows of the corridor as though nothing had happened at all. The moment he disappeared, Lenora grabbed Rosalind's wrist hard enough to hurt. "Listen to me carefully," she hissed under her breath. "Do not embarrass this family tonight." Rosalind stared at her aunt's hand until Lenora finally released her. "You mean what remains of it?" Lenora ignored that. The Duke is offering you survival. Be agreeable. Rosalind looked toward the dark hallway where Ashbourne had vanished moments earlier. Survival. The word felt colder now somehow. Clara appeared beside her carrying fresh gloves and a brush for her hair. Miss. Rosalind nodded faintly and allowed the maid to lead her upstairs again. Her hands shook slightly while Clara adjusted the loose strands of golden hair near her collar. He is frightening, Clara whispered softly. Rosalind stared at her reflection. Yes, but he looked at you differently. That unsettled Rosalind more than anything else had tonight. 10 minutes later she stood outside the West Library with the Duke's coat still wrapped around her shoulders because somehow nobody had asked for it back. Candlelight glowed beneath the heavy oak doors. She raised her hand to knock only for the door to open before her knuckles touched the wood. Ashbourne stood inside alone. The room behind him looked enormous. Dark shelves, low firelight, rain against tall windows. He had removed his gloves and loosened the collar of his black coat slightly. Exhaustion sharpened the harsh lines of his face now that nobody else watched him. Come in, he said quietly. Rosalind obeyed. The door closed behind her with a soft click that suddenly sounded very loud. Ashbourne crossed toward a small table near the fire where papers rested beside untouched whiskey. Sit. Rosalind lowered herself carefully into the chair opposite him. For several seconds neither spoke. The storm growled outside. Fire cracked softly in the hearth. Finally the Duke looked directly at her. Do you want honesty or comfort? The question startled her. I do not think comfort is being offered. A faint shadow of approval touched his expression. No, he admitted. It is not. He slid the marriage contract across the table toward her. Read it. Rosalind blinked in surprise. Most men in your position would simply demand a signature. Most men in my position are fools. She looked down at the document slowly. Legal language curled across the pages in heavy black ink. Her eyes widened after several seconds. This settlement is generous, Ashbourne finished calmly. Yes. Why? He studied her carefully before answering. Because I am not purchasing livestock, Miss Evercott. Rosalind swallowed hard. Then why marry me? The Duke leaned back slightly in his chair. Firelight flickered across the silver strands near his temples. Outside the storm deepened further around the old estate. Because, he said quietly, someone in this house taught you to survive pain without becoming cruel. Rosalind stared at him speechless. Ashbourne's eyes darkened slightly then. Tiredness pressed visibly against him now. That quality is rarer than beauty, he murmured. Another cough interrupted him suddenly. Violent this time. He turned sharply away, one hand gripping the edge of the desk hard enough for his knuckles to pale. Rosalind stood instinctively before she realized what she was doing. Your Grace. He lifted one hand immediately. Command. Stay back. By the time the coughing finally stopped, color had drained from his face beneath the candlelight. He breathed once through his nose before straightening again with visible effort. Rosalind could hear her own heartbeat now. You are ill, she whispered. Ashbourne looked at her steadily for several long seconds. Then he said the words that changed everything. I am dying. The fire cracked softly between them while the storm clawed against the windows like something trying to get inside. Rosalind could still hear the words echoing through her chest. I am dying. Not dramatic. Not emotional. Simply factual. Duke Thaddeus Ashbourne said it the way other men commented on the weather. She stared at him across the library table, trying to reconcile the terrifying force of the man with the weakness hidden beneath his skin. It did not fit together properly. Men who looked like him were not supposed to die quietly in dark rooms. They were supposed to outlive everyone else. How long have you known? She asked finally. Ashbourne folded the handkerchief calmly and slipped it back into his pocket. 6 months. And the doctors? Disagree with one another professionally while preparing for my funeral privately. His voice remained dry and controlled, but exhaustion sat heavily beneath every word now. Rosalind lowered her gaze briefly to the marriage contract between them. Then why marry at all? The Duke watched the fire instead of her. Because dying men discover unpleasant truths. What truth? That family becomes ambitious when they smell inheritance. The answer chilled her immediately. Ashbourne finally looked back at her. "You heard the rumors before I arrived tonight." Rosalind nodded faintly. "Some. Good." His expression hardened slightly. Fear keeps people observant. Rain struck the windows harder. The old library groaned softly around them. Rosalind studied him carefully now that the initial shock had faded enough for thought to return. His hands looked steady again. Too steady, controlled through effort rather than ease. "Your family knows?" she asked quietly. "That I am ill?" A humorless shadow crossed his face. "My family knows exactly how close I may be to the grave." Something dangerous flickered briefly in his eyes, then disappeared beneath restraint. "That is why they suddenly care whether I remarry." Rosalind felt the weight of the realization settle slowly into place. "You think they want something from me?" "No." Ashbourne leaned back slightly. "I know they do." Silence stretched between them. Rosalind glanced once more at the contract. The settlement was astonishingly generous. Properties, investments, legal protections no woman in her position should reasonably expect. "If you die," she said carefully, "everything transfers to me." "Yes. Your family will hate that." "They already do." The simplicity of the answer unsettled her more than anger would have. Ashbourne did not sound bitter. He sounded experienced. Rosalind swallowed slowly. "Then why would you put me in danger?" For the first time since entering the library, the Duke hesitated before answering. "Because," he said quietly, "you are already in danger." She looked up sharply. Ashbourne's eyes remained fixed on hers. A poor unmarried girl with a collapsing family name becomes vulnerable very quickly in this world. Men notice desperation. Rosalind thought suddenly of the creditors visiting Evercott House after her father's death. The way some of them smiled too long. The way Aunt Lenora always positioned herself between Rosalind and certain conversations. Ashbourne saw understanding settle across her face. "Exactly," he murmured. "Marriage to me solves that problem permanently. By replacing it with another one." A faint shadow of approval crossed his features again. "You are intelligent enough to survive Ashbourne Manor." Rosalind almost laughed softly at that. "You make it sound like a battlefield." "It is." The clock near the fireplace chimed once somewhere in the distance. Midnight. Rosalind suddenly realized her entire life had ended before midnight. Ashbourne rose slowly from his chair. The movement cost him more than he wanted visible. She noticed the brief tightening near his mouth, the careful breath afterward. He crossed toward the tall windows overlooking the storm-dark grounds. "Come here," he said quietly. Rosalind hesitated only a moment before standing. She moved beside him carefully, aware suddenly of how large he truly was up close. Even weakened by illness, the Duke carried an unsettling physical presence, like a storm barely held together by discipline alone. Outside, lightning flashed across the estate. Trees bent violently beneath the wind. "Tomorrow morning," Ashbourne said, "we leave for the north." Rosalind stared out at the darkness. "Immediately after the ceremony?" "Immediately. You truly do prefer efficiency." This time he almost smiled for real. It transformed his face briefly into something unexpectedly human before exhaustion erased it again. "Lingering creates opportunities for interference." "From your family?" "From everyone." Rosalind wrapped the coat tighter around herself unconsciously. It still carried warmth from his body. "I do not understand why you chose me specifically." Ashbourne remained silent long enough that she thought he might refuse to answer. Then he spoke quietly. 3 years ago, your father donated winter supplies to the mining villages outside Greyhaven." Rosalind blinked in confusion. "I remember. Most aristocrats sent money through committees." The Duke's gaze remained fixed outside. "Your father went himself." Rosalind's throat tightened slightly at the mention of him. "He believed charity should be personal." "Yes." Ashbourne nodded once. "You accompanied him." Her breath caught. "How do you know that?" Finally the Duke looked down at her. "Because one of the miners collapsed in the snow during the distribution." Rosalind stared at him silently. Memory flickered suddenly behind her eyes. Freezing wind. Snow up to her knees. Men unloading supplies near the mountain road. and one injured worker falling unconscious beside the wagons while everyone else hesitated because blood frightened wealthy people. She remembered kneeling beside the man despite ruining her coat. Remembered using her own scarf to stop the bleeding near his forehead. Remembered another man watching from horseback several yards away. Tall, silent, wrapped in black against the snowstorm. Rosalind's pulse slowed painfully. "That was you," she whispered. Ashbourne inclined his head once. Most people stepped backward when they saw blood. He was hurt. Yes. The Duke studied her quietly. You stepped forward anyway. Rosalind looked away first. Something about the memory unsettled her deeply now. You chose your wife because of a scarf in the snow? No, his voice lowered slightly. I chose my wife because kindness under comfortable circumstances means very little. Kindness when no reward exists means everything. The library suddenly felt too warm. Rosalind moved away from the window slowly. You speak as though this marriage is already decided. It is. She turned sharply toward him. You are very certain of yourself. I am very certain of the people around you. That silenced her. Ashbourne crossed back toward the table where the contract remained untouched. You still have a choice tonight. Rosalind frowned faintly. Do I? Yes. He rested one hand against the table edge. If you refuse this marriage, I will still settle your family debts. Her eyes widened in genuine shock. Why? Because your father was a decent man. And afterward? Afterward you may go wherever you wish. Rosalind stared at him in disbelief. You would simply let me leave. Yes. Without demanding anything in return. Yes. The room went very still then, because suddenly the marriage stopped feeling like imprisonment, which somehow made it more dangerous. Rosalind searched his face carefully for manipulation and found only exhaustion beneath restraint. Why would you offer that? She whispered. Ashbourne looked at her for several long seconds before answering. Because I know what it is like to be trapped by people who call it duty. Something old and painful moved quietly beneath those words. Rosalind felt it immediately. Not explained. Not visible. But there. Before she could respond, another violent cough tore through him without warning. This one dropped him hard against the edge of the table. The sound echoed brutally through the library. Rosalind crossed the room instinctively before he could stop her. Your Grace. Ashbourne tried to straighten immediately, but the coughing continued. Rough, deep, wrong. Rosalind reached for the crystal water glass nearby and held it toward him without thinking. For one strange second, he simply stared at her hand like he had forgotten kindness existed at all. Then slowly he accepted the glass. Their fingers brushed briefly. His skin felt cold. Not winter cold. Fever cold. He drank once before finally forcing the coughing back under control. Silence settled heavily afterward. Rosalind looked down and saw it clearly this time. Blood against the white handkerchief in his hand. Not much. Enough. Fear moved through her unexpectedly sharp. Ashbourne noticed. Now you understand the urgency. Rosalind lifted her eyes slowly toward him. You truly believe you are dying? No, his voice turned dangerously quiet. I believe someone is helping me get there. The words struck the room like lightning. Rosalind froze completely. Ashbourne folded the blood-stained cloth calmly and slipped it back into his pocket again. My physicians call it deterioration. His expression hardened. I call it convenient timing. Every candle in the library suddenly seemed dimmer. Rosalind stared at him with growing horror. You think someone is poisoning you? Ashbourne held her gaze steadily. I think, he said softly, that if I die before winter ends, several members of my family become extraordinarily wealthy. Silence crashed over the room. Outside, the storm roared harder across the black hills surrounding Evercott House. Rosalind felt the terrifying shape of the truth forming around her piece by piece now. This was not a marriage. It was a fortress, a battlefield, a warning disguised as a proposal. Ashbourne reached for the contract one final time and slid it gently toward her again. If you marry me, he said quietly, you walk into a war already in progress. Rosalind stared down at the paper. Her name waited at the bottom beside an untouched fountain pen. The fire cracked softly behind her. Somewhere deep inside the old house a clock began striking midnight again. one slow chime after another. Ashbourne watched her silently while exhaustion carved shadows deeper beneath his eyes. "And if I refuse?" she whispered. The Duke looked toward the dark windows where rain battered the glass endlessly. "Then tomorrow morning," he said quietly, "I return north alone." He paused. "And I will probably not survive the winter." Rosalind did not sleep at all after leaving the West Library. Dawn arrived gray and bitter against the windows of Evercott House while the storm finally weakened into cold rain drifting across the hills. Everything felt unreal in the pale morning light. Servants hurried through the corridors carrying flowers and black silk ribbons, while Aunt Lenora barked instructions sharp enough to cut skin. Somewhere downstairs a piano played softly for the arriving guests. Funeral music disguised as wedding music. Rosalind stood motionless before the mirror in her mother's old bedroom, while Clara fastened the final row of tiny pearl buttons down the back of her gown. The dress was ivory satin trimmed with old lace borrowed from Lenora's own wedding veil. Too elegant for comfort. Too beautiful for honesty. "You look like a duchess already," Clara whispered softly. Rosalind stared at her own reflection without expression. "No," she said quietly. "I look expensive." Clara's hands faltered briefly against the fabric. Mississippi Rosalind regretted the remark immediately. She closed her eyes for one tired second before forcing gentleness back into her voice. "I am sorry. You have been kind to me." The maid nodded quickly even though tears brightened her eyes now. "I just don't trust this," Clara whispered. "None of it feels right." Rosalind thought suddenly of blood against white linen, of Ashbourne's exhausted face beside the library fire, of the terrifying calm in his voice when he admitted someone might be poisoning him slowly. No, nothing about this felt right. A sharp knock interrupted them. Aunt Lenora entered without waiting for permission. Dark burgundy silk swept behind her across the floor like spilled wine. She looked triumphant this morning. That alone made Rosalind uneasy. "The guests are arriving," Lenora announced. Her gaze swept critically across the dress. "At least you photograph well." Rosalind remained still. "How comforting." Lenora ignored the bitterness easily. "You will smile today." "Why?" "Because powerful men dislike difficult wives." Rosalind turned slowly from the mirror then. "Do you know what he told me last night?" For the first time uncertainty flickered across Lenora's expression. "No, good." Rosalind stepped closer carefully. "Because I think you are safer that way." The color drained slightly from her aunt's face before irritation replaced it immediately. "Do not become dramatic now." "I am not dramatic," Rosalind said softly. "I am observant." Lenora's jaw tightened. "Whatever fantasies Ashbourne fed you about his miserable family are irrelevant. Once you marry him, your duty is simple. Produce an heir before he dies." The cruelty landed cold and clean between them. Clara looked horrified. Rosalind simply stared at her aunt for several long seconds. "And if he dies before that?" Lenora adjusted one of Rosalind's sleeves with detached precision. "Then at least your widowhood will be comfortable." Downstairs, guests filled the drawing room in dark, expensive clusters smelling faintly of perfume and wet wool. Rosalind heard whispers the moment she reached the staircase landing. "Poor girl. Old Ashbourne finally bought himself another bride. He looks half dead already. She cannot possibly survive that house." The voices blurred together beneath the pounding of her own pulse. Nobody sounded happy. Curious perhaps. Hungry certainly. But not happy. The chapel doors stood open at the far end of the corridor beneath rows of candlelight. Rosalind stopped breathing briefly when she saw him waiting at the altar. Thaddeus Ashbourne wore black instead of traditional wedding gray. Of course he did. The color made him look less like a groom and more like judgment standing beneath stained glass windows. Tall. Motionless. One hand resting lightly against his cane. Even weakened by illness, he dominated the entire chapel effortlessly. Conversations died whenever his gaze lifted. Men straightened unconsciously around him. Women looked away too quickly. Fear followed him naturally. Rosalind descended the staircase slowly while every eye in the room tracked her movement. She could feel pity moving through the crowd like smoke. Not for the Duke. For her. Ashbourne watched her approach with that same unnerving stillness from the night before. Yet something changed in his expression when she finally reached the aisle. Not warmth. Not softness. Recognition, perhaps. As though he had expected her to run. Bernard appeared beside her, offering his trembling arm. "You still have time," he whispered shakily. Rosalind looked at him in surprise. Guilt hollowed his face completely this morning. "To do what?" she asked quietly. "Leave." The word almost broke apart in his throat. "I can find some other arrangement." Rosalind glanced toward the altar where Ashbourne waited alone beneath candlelight. "No," she said softly. "You cannot." The music began. Low organ notes rolling heavily through the chapel while Rosalind walked toward the man everyone believed was dying. The aisle suddenly felt endless beneath her feet. Guests watched with expressions ranging from fascination to discomfort. Nobody smiled. Nobody celebrated. This was not a wedding. It was an agreement witnessed publicly so no one could later deny it happened. Ashbourne's eyes never left her once during the entire walk forward. Up close he looked worse than he had last night. Pale beneath the candlelight. Shadows carved sharply beneath his eyes. Exhaustion tightened the edges of his composure. Yet he remained terrifyingly upright through sheer force of will alone. Rosalind stopped beside him at the altar. For one brief second neither spoke while the minister fumbled nervously through his notes. Then quietly enough that only she could hear, Ashbourne murmured, "You came." Rosalind looked up at him carefully. "You sound surprised." Something flickered in his eyes. "Most people choose safety when given the chance. Perhaps I stopped believing in safe things a long time ago." The Duke studied her silently after that. The ceremony began. Words drifted through the cold chapel air almost meaninglessly. Honor, duty, faithfulness, protection. Rosalind answered automatically while the storm clouds outside pressed darkly against the stained glass windows. Ashbourne's voice remained steady through every vow despite the strain visibly tightening his body. Then halfway through the ceremony it happened. The Duke swayed slightly beside her. Almost invisible. Almost. Rosalind felt it immediately. His hand tightened hard around the silver head of his cane. Color drained from his face beneath the candlelight. The minister faltered mid-sentence. Murmurs rippled quietly through the guests. Ashbourne straightened instantly before anyone could step forward. Pride radiated from him sharply enough to wound. "Continue," he said coldly. The minister obeyed immediately. Yet Rosalind noticed something nobody else seemed to see. Ashbourne's breathing had changed. Controlled too carefully now. Pain hidden beneath discipline. Fear moved unexpectedly through her chest. Not because he frightened her. Because he looked determined to collapse standing rather than admit weakness publicly. When the minister instructed them to exchange rings, Ashbourne reached into his coat pocket slowly. His fingers trembled once. Just once. Rosalind acted before thinking. She steadied his hand gently beneath the cover of her bouquet so the guests could not see. The Duke froze completely. Their eyes met. Surprise flashed across his face so quickly she almost missed it. Then something else settled there quietly. Gratitude, perhaps. Dangerous thing. The ring slid onto her finger beneath 100 watching eyes. Heavy platinum. Cold as winter. The minister smiled nervously. "I now pronounce you husband and wife." Silence followed. No applause. No celebration. Only candlelight flickering across old stone walls while the new Duchess of Ashbourne stood beside a dying man everyone expected to be buried before spring. The minister cleared his throat awkwardly. "Your Grace, you may kiss your bride." Tension tightened instantly through the chapel. Rosalind felt it everywhere. Curiosity, anticipation, judgment. Ashbourne looked down at her for several long seconds. Close enough now that she could see faint silver threaded through his dark lashes. Smell cedar smoke lingering against his coat. Hear the roughness hidden beneath his breathing. Then very carefully, almost reverently, the Duke lifted one gloved hand and touched her cheek. The entire chapel seemed to stop breathing. His thumb brushed lightly beneath her jaw. Warm despite the coldness in his eyes. "You are trembling," he murmured quietly enough for only her to hear. "So are you," Rosalind whispered back. Something dangerously close to amusement touched his mouth, then vanished again. He lowered his head slowly and kissed her forehead instead of her lips. Soft, brief, unexpectedly gentle. Gasps moved through the chapel immediately afterward. Shocked whispers. confused expressions. Because men like Thaddeus Ashbourne were not supposed to kiss women carefully. They were supposed to consume them. The Duke stepped back before anyone could recover. "The ceremony is finished," he announced flatly. "We leave now." Lenora blinked in alarm. "Surely there will be a reception." "No, but the guests will survive disappointment." Ashbourne's voice sharpened slightly. "Unlike me if I remain standing much longer." Silence crashed across the chapel after that brutal honesty. Nobody knew how to respond. Rosalind saw embarrassment flash across Bernard's face, horror across Lenora's. But Ashbourne appeared completely unconcerned by either reaction. He turned toward Rosalind instead. "Can you travel immediately?" "Yes." "Good." Another cough caught suddenly in his chest. Harder this time. He turned away sharply into his handkerchief. Rosalind saw it again. Blood. More than last night. Fear struck through her instantly now. Real fear. Ashbourne folded the cloth before anyone else noticed and forced himself upright again through visible effort. One of his men hurried forward from the chapel entrance. Tall, weathered, northern accent roughening his voice. "Your Grace, the carriage is prepared." Ashbourne nodded once. Then the older man's eyes shifted briefly toward Rosalind. Something unreadable crossed his expression before he stepped closer to her instead of the Duke. Very quietly he pressed a small silver key into her gloved hand. Rosalind stared down at it in confusion. "What is this?" The man hesitated. His gaze flickered once toward Ashbourne before lowering again. "If his Grace dies before winter ends," he whispered softly, "run." The silver key felt unnaturally cold in Rosalind's palm, while the chapel slowly dissolved into nervous whispers around her. "Run." The word echoed louder than the organ music still drifting faintly through the stone hall. Ashbourne's man stepped back immediately after speaking, his weathered expression shuddering closed again before anyone noticed the exchange. Rosalind looked down briefly at the small key resting against her wedding glove. Simple silver. No markings. No explanation. Fear curled slowly through her stomach. Her husband noticed. Of course he did. Thaddeus Ashbourne missed very little. "Elias?" the Duke said quietly, his voice carrying warning beneath calm restraint. The older man lowered his head immediately. "Your Grace." Ashbourne held his gaze for one long second before looking back toward Rosalind. "The carriage is waiting." That was all. No public confrontation. No explanation. Yet tension sharpened instantly between the two men like invisible wire pulled too tight. Rosalind closed her fingers carefully around the key and slipped it into the hidden pocket sewn beneath the folds of her skirts. Nobody else in the chapel appeared to notice. Aunt Lenora approached quickly through the crowd before they could leave. "Your Grace," she said with brittle urgency. Surely Rosalind requires at least a few hours to prepare properly before such a long journey. Ashbourne looked exhausted now, pale beneath the chapel candlelight. Yet his eyes remained sharp enough to silence entire rooms. "Everything she requires has already been packed." Lenora forced a laugh. "Still, perhaps tomorrow morning would be more practical." "No. But the roads are dangerous during winter storms." "Exactly." His voice turned colder. "Which is why we leave now." Rosalind noticed something strange then. Relief flickered briefly across Elias's face at the Duke's refusal. Tiny, almost invisible, but there. As though remaining near Evercott House any longer created some kind of additional danger. Lenora pressed onward anyway. "At least allow your bride a farewell luncheon with her family." Ashbourne finally looked directly at her. Fully. The chapel went silent again immediately. "Madam," he said quietly, "your family sold her yesterday." The cruelty landed cleanly. Lenora's mouth parted slightly. Ashbourne continued before she could recover. "Do not insult either of us by pretending sentiment now." Rosalind should have felt embarrassed. Instead, something far more dangerous moved quietly through her chest. Protection. Nobody had ever spoken for her like that before. The Duke extended one gloved hand toward her without looking away from Lenora. "Come, Duchess." "Duchess." The word settled strangely against her skin. Heavy. Unreal. Rosalind placed her hand carefully into his. Warmth closed around her fingers instantly despite the winter cold surrounding them. Ashbourne's grip remained steady even though she could feel exhaustion radiating beneath the surface of his composure now. Together they walked through the chapel aisle while guests parted silently around them. Nobody attempted conversation. Nobody congratulated them. People stepped aside the same way crowds moved away from approaching storms. Outside, freezing rain drifted through the gray afternoon sky. The black carriage waited at the bottom of the chapel steps with 4 massive horses stamping impatiently against the wet stone. 2 riders dressed in dark Ashbourne colors remained mounted nearby, scanning the empty road constantly. Watching, Rosalind noticed that too. "Your Grace." A young servant hurried toward them carrying Rosalind's traveling case. "Your belongings, ma'am." Ashbourne took the case himself before the servant could hand it toward Rosalind. The movement looked automatic, unthinking, as though carrying burdens for other people came naturally to him despite the obvious pain tightening every line of his body. "I can carry that," Rosalind protested softly. "I know." He did not release it. They descended the slick chapel stairs carefully. Halfway down, another brutal cough seized him suddenly. Ashbourne stopped hard against the stone railing, one hand gripping it tightly while the coughing tore through his chest. Rosalind moved toward him instinctively again. This time he did not tell her to stay back. Rain dampened the dark strands of hair near his temples while he struggled silently for breath. Elias approached immediately from the carriage. "Your Grace." "Not here," Ashbourne rasped quietly. Blood stained the edge of the white handkerchief again. More than before, Rosalind felt genuine alarm sharpen through her chest now. Not distant concern. Fear. The Duke saw it on her face immediately. "I am not dying on church steps," he muttered roughly. Somehow the dry humor inside the statement startled a breath of laughter out of her despite everything. Ashbourne looked at her sharply then. Really looked at her. Rain slid slowly down the side of his face while surprise flickered across his exhausted expression. "There it is," he murmured quietly. Rosalind frowned faintly. "What?" "Proof you are still alive under all that fear." The words hit her harder than they should have. Before she could answer, the Duke straightened again through visible effort and guided her toward the carriage. The interior smelled faintly of leather, cedar smoke, and winter air. Thick velvet curtains softened the gray daylight filtering through narrow windows. Rosalind settled carefully onto one seat while Ashbourne lowered himself across from her with controlled precision. The moment the carriage door closed, his composure cracked slightly. He leaned back against the dark leather with his eyes briefly shut. Not dramatic, simply exhausted beyond concealment now. Elias climbed into the front beside the driver. Moments later the carriage lurched forward through the freezing rain. Rosalind watched Evercott House slowly disappear behind them through the blurred carriage window. The old estate looked smaller already beneath the storm-dark sky. Sadder somehow. She expected grief. Instead she felt strangely hollow. Ashbourne opened his eyes after several minutes of silence. "You are not crying." Rosalind turned from the window. "Should I be? Most brides leaving home forever would." She looked down at the platinum ring resting against her gloved hand. Most brides are not fleeing potential murder plots with dying dukes. A rough sound escaped him suddenly. Rosalind realized after a second that it was laughter. Real laughter. Low and brief and rusty from disuse. The sound transformed him unexpectedly. Human instead of mythic. Dangerous in an entirely different way. "You adjust quickly," he observed. "I learned early that panic rarely improves situations." Ashbourne studied her quietly while the carriage rolled deeper into the winter countryside. Rain tapped steadily against the windows. "Your father taught you that?" "No," Rosalind looked back toward the fading horizon. "My mother did before she died." Silence settled softly between them after that. The road north worsened by evening. Snow replaced rain gradually until white drifted endlessly across the darkening hills outside. The carriage rocked violently over frozen roads while distant forests swallowed the last traces of daylight. Ashbourne spoke very little during the journey. Not coldness exactly. Conservation. Like a man carefully rationing strength he no longer possessed in abundance. Twice Rosalind caught him staring out the window with his jaw clenched tightly against obvious pain. 3 times she heard him cough quietly into blood-stained linen he believed she could not see. By nightfall, the interior of the carriage had grown cold despite thick blankets folded beneath the seats. Rosalind's hands trembled slightly from exhaustion and winter chill. Without a word, Ashbourne reached beside him and handed her a heavy black wool blanket. "Take it. You need it more." Rosalind. The first time he used her given name. Quiet, roughened by fatigue. Something strange tightened briefly inside her chest. "Take the blanket." She obeyed because arguing suddenly felt childish. The wool carried faint warmth when she wrapped it around herself. "Thank you." Ashbourne nodded once before looking back toward the window. Another hour passed in near silence. Darkness deepened completely around them. The world outside vanished beneath snow and black forest shadows. Then suddenly the carriage slowed hard. Rosalind sat upright immediately. "What happened?" Elias's voice carried faintly from outside through the storm. "Riders." Every muscle in Ashbourne's body tightened instantly. Not panic. Readiness. He reached slowly beneath the seat beside him and withdrew a polished black revolver from hidden storage. Rosalind stared at it in shock. The Duke noticed. "Do not be alarmed. You keep firearms beneath carriage seats?" "Only during attempted assassinations." His tone remained disturbingly calm. Snow swirled violently beyond the windows now. Rosalind could barely see shapes moving outside through the darkness. Horsemen. For perhaps, maybe 5. Ashbourne checked the revolver carefully before resting it beside him within easy reach. "Stay inside no matter what happens." Rosalind's pulse hammered painfully now. "Who are they?" "If we are fortunate," he said quietly. "Merely thieves." The carriage stopped completely. Silence crashed heavily around them beneath the storm. Then footsteps approached slowly through the snow outside. One side of Ashbourne's coat had shifted slightly open during the movement. Rosalind froze when she noticed the dark stain spreading faintly beneath his ribs through the black fabric. Blood. Fresh blood. Her eyes lifted sharply toward him. The Duke followed her gaze downward. For one brief second something unreadable passed across his face. Then he looked back up at her steadily. "Now you understand," he said softly. "Why I needed a wife before reaching home." Before Rosalind could speak, someone struck the carriage door from outside. Once. Hard enough to rattle the entire frame. Then a strange familiar voice drifted through the storm. "Open the door, Your Grace. It is family." The storm swallowed everything beyond the carriage windows. Snow hammered against black glass while the horses shifted restlessly outside. Rosalind sat frozen beneath the heavy wool blanket with her eyes fixed on the carriage door. Family. The word sounded wrong in the mouth of a stranger arriving through darkness with armed riders. Across from her, Thaddeus Ashbourne remained terrifyingly calm. Too calm. One gloved hand rested near the revolver beside him while blood slowly darkened the side of his coat beneath his ribs. He looked less like a dying man now and more like something dangerous cornered too many times before. Another knock rattled the carriage. Harder. "Open the door, cousin." The voice called again through the storm. Male. Educated. Smiling underneath the politeness somehow. "Surely you are not frightened of family." Ashbourne's eyes never left the door. "That depends which branch of the family tree is speaking." A faint laugh drifted through the snow outside. "You always were suspicious." The Duke finally looked toward Rosalind. "Stay behind me." Before she could answer, he opened the carriage door himself. Freezing wind tore instantly through the interior carrying snow and darkness with it. A man stood outside beside a black horse beneath the storm lanterns. Tall, elegant, perhaps 35 years old. Dark blonde hair damp with snow. Expensive gray wool coat trimmed with silver fur. Handsome in the polished aristocratic way that made people trust him too quickly. His smile widened when he saw Rosalind inside the carriage. "Ah," he murmured softly. "So the rumors were true. You actually married her." Ashbourne's expression hardened immediately. "State your purpose, Lucien." Lucien. The name settled unpleasantly through Rosalind's chest. The man removed his gloves slowly. Such hostility. His pale eyes shifted briefly toward the blood-staining Ashbourne's coat. Satisfaction flickered there too quickly to hide completely. Rosalind saw it immediately. So did the Duke. "I came to escort you home safely," Lucien continued smoothly. "The roads north are dangerous this time of year." Ashbourne leaned slightly against the carriage frame. And yet somehow you found me easily enough. Snow drifted across Lucien's shoulders while he smiled calmly through the storm. News travels quickly when a dying duke suddenly acquires a bride. The word dying hung between them deliberately. Testing. Ashbourne's hand moved slightly nearer the revolver. Careful, he said quietly. Lucien lifted both hands lightly. Relax. I am family. Exactly. Silence tightened instantly. Even the storm suddenly seemed quieter around the carriage. Lucien's smile thinned faintly. You look terrible, cousin. You look disappointed that I am still breathing. Rosalind watched the exchange carefully while cold fear slowly sharpened inside her chest. Nothing about this felt normal. These were not relatives greeting newlyweds. This was strategy disguised as conversation. Lucien finally turned his full attention toward Rosalind. Forgive my manners. Lady Ashbourne, I presume. Rosalind forced herself to hold his gaze steadily despite the unease crawling beneath her skin. Rosalind Ashbourne. Something unreadable crossed Lucien's face at hearing the name spoken aloud. Realization, perhaps. The marriage had become real now. Legal. Dangerous. You are younger than expected, he observed softly. You are more obvious than expected, Ashbourne replied before Rosalind could answer. Lucien's pale eyes flickered back toward his cousin again. Still paranoid. Still alive. Another sharp silence followed. Then suddenly Ashbourne coughed violently into his hand. The force of it bent him slightly forward against the carriage frame. Blood stained the white linen immediately this time. Too much to hide. Lucien's expression changed before he could stop it. Hope. Pure ugly hope. Rosalind saw it clearly now. The Duke noticed her noticing. His eyes shifted toward her only briefly before hardening again. Elias, Ashbourne said quietly without looking away from Lucien. We are leaving. Of course, Your Grace. Elias moved immediately from the driver's bench, one hand resting near the holster beneath his coat now. Lucien stepped backward slowly through the snow. You should not travel in your condition. And yet here I am. You may not survive the journey. Ashbourne's mouth curved very slightly then. Not warmth. Something colder. You sound concerned. Lucien returned the smile instantly. I sound practical. The Duke reached for the carriage door. Give my regards to the vultures waiting at Ashbourne Manor. For the first time irritation flashed openly across Lucien's face. You cannot protect her forever. Rosalind felt the entire atmosphere shift at those words. Dangerous now. Personal. Ashbourne straightened fully despite obvious pain tightening every movement. Snow drifted slowly through the dark strands of his hair while his voice turned terrifyingly soft. Watch me. Then he slammed the carriage door shut. The horses lunged forward moments later through the storm while Lucien and his riders disappeared slowly into darkness behind them. Inside the carriage, silence crashed heavily between Rosalind and the Duke. Ashbourne leaned back hard against the seat with his eyes briefly closed. The color had drained badly from his face now. You are bleeding, Rosalind whispered. Yes. That does not seem to concern you nearly enough. It concerns Elias constantly. One of us should remain calm. Despite herself, she almost smiled. Almost. Another wave of exhaustion crossed his features before disappearing beneath restraint again. Rosalind looked carefully toward the dark stain spreading beneath his ribs. That injury is recent. Ashbourne opened his eyes slowly. Observant. Answer the question. Something flickered across his face then. Surprise, perhaps. Women probably did not order him around often. 3 days old, he admitted quietly. Knife wound. Fear tightened sharply through Rosalind's chest. From whom? An employee with poor career instincts. That is not amusing. No, he looked toward the storm-dark window. It is not. The carriage rolled deeper into the frozen wilderness while snow thickened heavily around them. Rosalind studied him carefully in the dim lantern light. The signs were impossible to ignore now. The shallow breathing. The gray exhaustion beneath his skin. The way one hand occasionally pressed subtly against his side when he thought she was not looking. You should let me examine the wound. Ashbourne turned his head slowly toward her. Absolutely not. You are bleeding through your coat. I noticed. You may have a fever. Probably. Then stop being impossible. Silence. Then unexpectedly the Duke laughed again. Softer this time. Tired enough to sound almost human. There is the fire. Rosalind frowned faintly. What fire? The part of you that stops being frightened when someone needs help. The words unsettled her because they were true. Fear still existed, but concern had begun replacing it piece by piece. Dangerous thing. The carriage suddenly lurched violently sideways through deep snow. Rosalind grabbed the seat instinctively. Outside, the horses whinnied sharply against the wind. Elias's voice cut through the storm. Bridge ahead. Ashbourne's expression hardened instantly. Too soon. The river froze early this year, Elias called back. We either cross now or lose 6 hours going east. The Duke looked toward the dark windows, calculating silently. Then another harsh cough tore through him before he could answer. Blood spotted the edge of his mouth this time. Rosalind moved immediately across the carriage without thinking. Enough! Ashbourne looked up sharply just as she reached for the buttons of his black coat. What are you doing? Saving your life if possible. Rosalind, be quiet. The command slipped out before she could soften it. For one astonishing second the Duke actually obeyed. She opened the heavy wool coat carefully. Beneath it, the white shirt wrapped around his ribs was soaked dark crimson near his left side. Rosalind inhaled sharply. The wound was not fresh anymore. Worse, angry redness spread outward beneath the bandages. Fever heat radiated through the fabric immediately against her fingertips. Infection. Ashbourne watched her expression carefully now. There, he said quietly. Now you understand why Lucien looked disappointed. Rosalind ignored him and reached instead for the small medical case secured beneath the opposite seat. Who bandaged this? A physician. A bad one. She peeled the outer bandage back carefully while the carriage rattled violently across the frozen road. Ashbourne's jaw tightened visibly, but he made no sound. The restraint alone frightened her. Men did not endure pain that quietly unless they were very accustomed to it. This should have been cleaned properly days ago, Rosalind muttered. I was occupied avoiding assassination attempts. You joke when injured. I prefer it to screaming. Despite the tension, another startled breath of laughter escaped her softly. Ashbourne watched her very closely after that. Too closely. Rosalind focused on the wound instead. Deep but clean originally. The surrounding inflammation worried her more. Someone had stitched it carelessly, or intentionally poorly. Her thoughts froze suddenly around that realization. Intentional. Slowly she looked back up toward him. Who treated you? Ashbourne held her gaze steadily. My family physician. The carriage seemed colder instantly. Rosalind looked back down at the wound beneath her hands. Infection spreading. Blood loss. Fever. Convenient deterioration. The horrifying shape of the truth sharpened further now. Oh my God! She whispered softly. Ashbourne's voice lowered almost to nothing. Yes. Snow battered the carriage harder while the frozen river bridge emerged somewhere ahead through darkness. Rosalind reached for clean cloth inside the medical kit with suddenly shaking hands. Your physician is poisoning you too. Before Ashbourne could answer, Elias shouted sharply from outside. Hold on. The horses screamed suddenly against the storm. Then the entire carriage dropped violently sideways as the ice beneath them cracked. The sound of cracking ice split through the storm like gunfire. Rosalind grabbed the edge of the carriage seat as the entire vehicle lurched violently sideways again. One of the horses screamed outside. Wood groaned beneath them. Snow blasted against the windows in blinding white waves while the frozen river beneath the carriage shifted with deep, terrifying cracks. Move! Ashbourne ordered sharply. Rosalind barely had time to react before the Duke lunged across the carriage despite his injuries and shoved her hard toward the opposite seat just as the ice beneath her side shattered completely. Freezing black water exploded upward through the broken floorboards. The carriage dropped violently at an angle. Rosalind slammed against the leather cushions with a cry while icy river water flooded instantly around her boots. Outside, men shouted over the storm. Horses fought wildly against their harnesses. Ashbourne braced one hand against the collapsing carriage wall while pain carved brutal lines through his face. Rosalind. His voice cut through the chaos sharply. Look at me. She did. Snow swirled through the widening cracks around them now. The carriage tilted lower inch by inch toward the river. Ashbourne's eyes locked onto hers with terrifying steadiness. When I open that door, you climb toward Elias immediately. What about you? Do not argue. Another violent crack thundered beneath them. The carriage dropped further. Freezing water surged around Rosalind's ankles now. Fear clawed brutally through her chest. No, for the first time genuine anger flashed across the Duke's exhausted face. Rosalind, I am not leaving you in here. Silence hit between them for one suspended second while the storm roared outside. Then, unexpectedly, something changed in his expression. Not frustration, recognition, like he had just realized something dangerous about her. The carriage lurched again. Ashbourne reached for the door handle immediately. When it opens, climb. He forced the swollen carriage door outward against the pressure of snow and ice. Wind exploded through the interior instantly. Elias appeared outside through the blizzard with snow coating his beard and shoulders white. Your Grace, take her first. No, Rosalind grabbed the edge of the doorway hard enough for her fingers to ache. We go together. Another brutal cough tore suddenly through Ashbourne's chest. Blood stained the snow near his mouth immediately before the wind scattered it away. Elias looked genuinely alarmed now. Sir, the river is giving way. Ashbourne's breathing roughened painfully. Yet his hand still reached instinctively toward Rosalind before himself. Climb, he ordered again. Rosalind hated that even terrified. She still obeyed the sound of that voice. Elias caught her arm and hauled her upward through the storm onto solid ice several feet away from the sinking carriage. Snow hammered against her face instantly. The freezing wind stole breath from her lungs. Behind her, Ashbourne attempted to climb after them. Halfway through the movement, the carriage shifted violently again beneath him. Wood cracked sharply. The Duke lost balance for one dangerous second and dropped hard against the broken frame. Rosalind moved before thinking. Thaddeus. The name escaped her naturally for the first time. Not Your Grace. Not Duke. Him. His eyes lifted sharply toward her through the storm. Surprise flickered there even now. Rosalind ignored Elias shouting behind her and crawled back across the unstable ice toward the half-submerged carriage. Lady Ashbourne! Elias barked in horror. Get back! She reached the carriage just as another section of ice splintered beneath it. Ashbourne looked furious now. What are you doing? Saving your life, apparently. She grabbed his arm before he could argue further. Even through layers of wet wool she could feel fever burning beneath his skin. Together she and Elias dragged him free seconds before the carriage finally gave way entirely beneath the ice. Black water swallowed it instantly into darkness below. The horses barely escaped forward with the remaining guards pulling desperately at the reins through the storm. Everyone stumbled backward across the frozen river while the ice groaned dangerously beneath their weight. By the time they reached solid ground near the riverbank, Rosalind's hands were numb with cold and Ashbourne could barely remain standing. Snow coated his black coat and dark hair completely now. Blood still seeped steadily through the ruined bandages beneath his ribs. Elias swore under his breath quietly when he saw it. We are 4 miles from Blackthorn Lodge, he said sharply. That is the nearest shelter. Ashbourne shook his head once immediately. No, Elias stared at him in disbelief. Sir, Blackthorn belongs to Lucian. Understanding hit Rosalind instantly. Trap. Elias looked grim now too. Then Ashbourne Manor is another 3 hours north minimum in this weather. The Duke's face had gone frighteningly pale beneath the snow. Still he remained upright through sheer force of will alone. We keep moving. Another cough interrupted him hard enough to bend him slightly forward again. Rosalind stepped beside him immediately before he could fall. His weight shifted against her for one brief dangerous second. Heavy. Burning with fever now. He realized it instantly and pulled away again through visible effort. I am fine. You are bleeding through 3 layers of clothing. Still alive though. Barely. Their eyes met sharply through the storm. Then unexpectedly the corner of his mouth twitched faintly upward. There she is again. Rosalind frowned. Who? The woman who stops being afraid once there is work to do. The words settled strangely through her chest while snow swirled around them endlessly. Elias approached, leading 2 horses forward through the storm. The carriage is gone, he said grimly. We ride from here. Ashbourne nodded once before another wave of dizziness visibly hit him. Rosalind caught the movement immediately. So did Elias. Fear darkened the older man's expression now. Your Grace. Do not. Ashbourne's voice sharpened instantly. I am not dying in the woods like some tragic poet. Even now dry humor threaded beneath the pain. Rosalind almost smiled despite herself. Elias helped the Duke onto horseback carefully, while the remaining guards secured supplies salvaged from the river crossing. Snow covered everything now. Endless white swallowing roads and trees alike beneath the night storm. Rosalind mounted beside Ashbourne with trembling hands while Elias handed her a thick fur-lined cloak. Stay close to his Grace, he instructed quietly. If he loses consciousness, tell me immediately. Ashbourne shot him a murderous look. Elias. Sir, respectfully, you are one bad cough away from meeting God. Charming. The older man ignored him completely and turned toward Rosalind instead. The manor physician will be waiting when we arrive. Rosalind tightened slightly at those words. The physician who treated this wound? Elias hesitated. Snow drifted heavily across his weathered face. Yes. And you trust him? Silence. Tiny. But enough. Rosalind's stomach tightened instantly. Ashbourne noticed both reactions immediately. Interesting, he murmured softly. Elias cursed quietly under his breath. This is not the place. No, Ashbourne agreed. It is not. They rode north through darkness for what felt like hours. Wind screamed through the frozen forest while branches bent heavily beneath accumulating snow. Rosalind could barely feel her fingers anymore. Yet every few minutes her eyes drifted instinctively toward the Duke riding beside her. He was getting worse. She could see it now even in darkness. The rigid posture weakening gradually. The occasional loss of focus in his eyes. The way his gloved hand pressed harder against his injured side after every coughing fit. Fever was consuming him piece by piece. Around midnight Ashbourne nearly fell from the saddle. It happened quickly. 1 second he sat upright. The next his body swayed dangerously sideways as consciousness flickered beneath exhaustion and blood loss. Rosalind reached him first. Thaddeus! Her horse pressed close against his through deep snow while she grabbed the front of his coat hard enough to steady him. His eyes opened slowly, disoriented briefly, human for the first time since she met him. You are freezing, she whispered. So are you. You need a doctor. I need sleep and less attempted murder. Even weakened and half delirious, he still sounded dryly amused. Rosalind's chest tightened painfully at that. Something dangerous was happening to her. Fear had become concern. Concern had become attachment quietly without permission. Ashbourne looked at her strangely then. Snow gathered across his lashes while exhaustion stripped away some of the walls he usually carried so carefully. You should have stayed at Evercott House, he said softly. No, Rosalind. No, the word came sharper this time. Do not tell me to regret this. His eyes held hers silently through the storm. Then something shifted behind them. Something old and lonely and unbearably tired. You do not understand what happens to people near me. Rosalind thought suddenly of blood. Poison. Family members smiling while waiting for him to die. I understand enough. Silence stretched between them beneath the falling snow. Then very quietly, almost like the words escaped without permission, the Duke murmured, Do not leave me too. Rosalind stopped breathing. He looked shocked immediately afterward, as though he had not meant to speak aloud at all. Fever blurred the edges of his composure now. Vulnerability slipped through the cracks accidentally. Elias rode closer through the storm before either of them could speak again. Manor lights ahead, he called out. Rosalind looked up sharply through the darkness. Far beyond the frozen trees, faint golden lights glowed against the storm. Ashbourne Manor. Huge. Distant. Waiting. The Duke straightened slowly in the saddle despite obvious agony tightening every movement once more. The weakness vanished behind cold discipline again piece by piece. Walls rebuilding themselves. Remember this carefully, he said quietly without looking at her. No one inside that house is your friend. Snow drifted endlessly between them while the massive black silhouette of Ashbourne Manor slowly emerged from the storm ahead. Then the Duke coughed hard into his gloved hand one final time before lowering it slowly into the pale moonlight. Fresh blood covered his fingers completely. Ashbourne Manor rose out of the storm like something built to survive the end of the world. Massive black stone walls towered above the frozen cliffs, overlooking miles of snow-covered wilderness. Narrow windows glowed faint gold against the darkness, while iron gates groaned open slowly as the riders approached through deep snow. Rosalind stared upward from horseback with cold dread tightening through her chest. The manor did not look like a home. It looked like a fortress where mercy had been buried years ago. Beside her, Thaddeus Ashbourne swayed slightly in the saddle again before forcing himself upright through visible effort. Blood still darkened the inside of his glove. Fever burned openly across his pale skin now. Yet the moment the gates opened fully, something changed in him. Weakness disappeared beneath cold authority piece by piece. The Duke returned. Servants lined the entrance stairs despite the storm. Footmen in dark gray coats. Maids with lowered eyes. Stable hands frozen beneath blowing snow. None of them looked relieved to see their master alive. They looked nervous. Watching. Measuring. Rosalind noticed that immediately. So did Ashbourne. "Interesting," he murmured softly. "No one expected us tonight." The riders stopped before the towering entrance doors. Elias dismounted instantly and moved toward the Duke. "Careful, sir. I am not 90. "No," Elias muttered quietly. "You are simply bleeding internally in a snowstorm." Despite everything, Rosalind nearly smiled again. Ashbourne descended from the horse with controlled precision that fooled nobody standing nearby. The moment his boots hit the stone steps, a violent wave of dizziness visibly struck him. Rosalind stepped forward instinctively before he could fall. His hand caught her arm automatically, strong despite the fever burning through him. For one dangerous second his weight rested partly against her. Then the front doors burst open. Warm light spilled across the snow-covered steps. A woman emerged first, tall, immaculately dressed in deep navy silk despite the late hour. Dark hair pinned sharply away from an elegant, severe face. Mid-40s perhaps. Beautiful in the same cold way winter oceans were beautiful. Her eyes landed first on Ashbourne, then on the blood staining his coat, then on Rosalind. Nothing in her expression changed. "Thaddeus," she said smoothly, "you look dreadful." The Duke straightened instantly away from Rosalind. "Good evening, Vivian." Vivian. The name settled unpleasantly through Rosalind's thoughts. The woman descended the stairs slowly without removing her gloves despite the storm. Every movement looked controlled, calculated. "We received word that your carriage disappeared near Blackwater River." Her gaze flicked once toward the blood on his hand again. "I assumed the river finally succeeded where your enemies keep failing." Ashbourne's expression remained unreadable. "Disappointed." Vivian's lips curved faintly. "Never publicly." Silence tightened sharply between them. Rosalind realized suddenly this woman was not merely family. She was dangerous. Vivian finally turned toward her fully. Pale gray eyes swept over Rosalind from head to toe in one elegant cutting motion. "So this is the bride. Not warmth. Not welcome. Assessment." Rosalind held her gaze steadily despite exhaustion clawing through her body now. "Rosalind Ashbourne." Something flickered very briefly behind Vivian's eyes at hearing the name spoken aloud, then vanished beneath composure. "How quickly you adapted." Ashbourne stepped subtly closer to Rosalind before Vivian could continue. Small movement, protective, instinctive. Vivian noticed immediately. That unsettled her more than the marriage itself seemed to. "Interesting," she murmured softly. Another harsh cough tore suddenly through the Duke's chest before anyone could speak again. This time blood splattered visibly against the snow-covered stone steps. Several servants gasped quietly. Vivian's expression sharpened instantly. Not concern. Calculation. Rosalind saw it clearly now. Ashbourne wiped the blood away calmly as though it meant nothing. "Where is Dr. Pembroke?" he asked coldly. Vivian folded her gloved hands together. "Waiting inside." Naturally. The word naturally felt wrong somehow. Elias moved beside Rosalind quietly while servants hurried forward toward the Duke. "Stay close," he muttered under his breath. "And trust nobody carrying medicine." Fear tightened through Rosalind immediately. The entrance hall swallowed them all moments later. Warmth hit her first, then silence. Ashbourne Manor smelled faintly of cedar smoke, polished stone, and something older beneath both. Something heavy. The entrance hall stretched upward 3 stories beneath iron chandeliers and dark carved balconies. Portraits lined the towering walls. Generations of Ashbourne men stared down coldly from gold frames above black marble floors. Nobody in any painting looked kind. Servants moved quickly through the hall with lowered eyes while the Duke crossed the room like a wounded king refusing collapse before witnesses. Rosalind stayed beside him instinctively now. Every few steps his breathing roughened further. Fever heat radiated visibly beneath his pale skin. At the far end of the hall, another figure waited near the massive staircase. Older, thin, silver-haired, dressed entirely in black. Dr. Pembroke. The physician's eyes widened slightly upon seeing the Duke still alive. Tiny reaction. Almost invisible. Rosalind saw it immediately. So did Ashbourne. "Doctor," the Duke said quietly. Pembroke recovered instantly and hurried forward carrying a leather medical case. "Your Grace." His voice sounded perfectly professional. Too perfect. "You should be in bed immediately. How fortunate you continue recommending that." Pembroke hesitated fractionally. "Your condition is serious." "Yes," Ashbourne replied softly. "I suspect that is intentional." Silence crashed hard across the entrance hall. Vivian's expression did not move at all. Dr. Pembroke froze only briefly before forcing concern back into his features. "You are feverish. Delirium is common under such strain." Rosalind watched the exchange carefully while cold understanding spread slowly through her chest. They all knew. Not openly perhaps, but enough. The Duke looked at the physician for one long terrifying second. Then suddenly his knees buckled beneath him. Everything happened at once afterward. Servants gasped. Elias surged forward. Dr. Pembroke reached instinctively for the Duke's arm. But Rosalind got there first. "Thaddeus!" His full weight nearly dragged her down with him before Elias caught the other side. Ashbourne's breathing turned ragged now. Fever burned violently beneath his skin. Yet, even half collapsing, he shoved Pembroke's hand away hard enough to stagger the physician backward. "Not him," the Duke rasped harshly. The entire hall went still. Rosalind stared down at him in shock. His eyes lifted toward hers through obvious pain and exhaustion. "You." One word. Barely audible, but unmistakable. He trusted her instead. Dr. Pembroke recovered quickly. "Your Grace, you are not thinking clearly." "No," Ashbourne breathed roughly. "I am thinking clearly for the first time in months." Blood stained his lips again. Vivian moved closer slowly now. "Thaddeus." Her voice softened slightly. "Dangerous thing. You need treatment." "From him." The Duke's laugh sounded rough and exhausted. "I would rather let wolves finish the job." Several servants lowered their eyes immediately after that. Fear moved visibly through the room. Rosalind looked between the physician and the blood soaking through Ashbourne's coat. Infection. Fever. Possible poisoning. Knife wound. Nothing about this was survivable without help. Yet the Duke would rather bleed onto the marble floor than let Dr. Pembroke touch him again. That terrified her more than the storm ever had. Vivian's eyes shifted slowly toward Rosalind. Assessing. Calculating. "You truly intend to trust a frightened 19-year-old girl with your life?" Ashbourne looked at Rosalind instead of his sister. "Yes." The answer came instantly. Absolute. Something inside Rosalind tightened painfully at the sound of it. Nobody had ever trusted her with anything important before. Not like this. Elias stepped forward immediately. "The East Wing has already been prepared." Vivian's gaze sharpened slightly. "Interesting choice." "The West Wing remains locked by His Grace's orders," Elias replied evenly. "As always." West Wing. The silver key hidden beneath Rosalind's skirts suddenly felt heavier. Ashbourne attempted to straighten again, but another brutal wave of coughing bent him sharply forward. Blood stained the marble floor this time. Real fear moved through the servants now. The Duke looked moments from collapse completely. Rosalind made her decision instantly. "We need hot water, clean linens, whiskey, needles, and fresh bandages." Everyone stared at her. even Vivian. Rosalind ignored them all and looked directly at Elias instead. Now, the older man blinked once in surprise before nodding immediately. Yes, Duchess. Duchess. The word landed differently this time. Not decorative. Authority. Vivian watched her carefully while servants scattered into motion around the hall. You have experience treating injuries? Rosalind looked back toward the blood soaking through her husband's ruined coat. No, she said quietly. But apparently neither does your physician. Silence slammed through the hall after that. Dr. Pembroke paled instantly. Vivian's expression finally cracked just slightly. Not anger. Interest. Dangerous interest. Ashbourne lifted his eyes slowly toward Rosalind through exhaustion and fever. For the first time since she met him, something warm flickered faintly behind all that cold restraint. Pride, perhaps. Then suddenly his body gave out completely. The Duke collapsed hard against her shoulder with one rough, exhausted breath, and whispered only one thing before losing consciousness. Do not let them near me. Ashbourne Manor did not sleep. Even after midnight, servants moved silently through endless dark corridors carrying lanterns and steaming basins, while snow battered the towering windows without mercy. Rosalind walked beside Elias through the eastern wing with Thaddeus Ashbourne's blood still staining the sleeves of her wedding gown. The Duke had not regained consciousness since collapsing in the entrance hall. 2 footmen carried him carefully between them while every servant they passed lowered their eyes immediately. Fear followed him even unconscious. The eastern chambers opened behind heavy double doors carved from black walnut. Warm firelight glowed across dark velvet curtains and towering bookshelves lining the walls. The room looked less like a bedroom and more like a war general's private fortress. Large, severe, controlled. Nothing soft except the exhaustion bleeding across the man lying motionless on the bed. Leave us, Rosalind said quietly the moment the servants settled him onto the mattress. Nobody moved at first. Elias looked toward her carefully. Duchess, all of you. Her voice sharpened slightly. Now. The servants obeyed immediately. Even Dr. Pembroke, lingering near the doorway, hesitated only briefly before withdrawing beneath Rosalind's cold stare. Vivian remained last. She stood near the fire wrapped elegantly in navy silk while snowlight flickered across her pale face. If he dies tonight, she said calmly, the entire estate changes. Rosalind looked up sharply. Vivian's expression never moved. Many people inside this house will become very desperate very quickly. Including you? A faint, almost smile touched Vivian's mouth. Good. She turned toward the doorway slowly. At least you are not stupid. Then she disappeared into the corridor without another word. Silence settled heavily across the room afterward. Only the storm remained. Wind against glass. Fire cracking softly in the hearth. And Thaddeus Ashbourne breathing unevenly against white linen sheets already spotted faint pink from blood. Rosalind moved toward the bed slowly. Up close beneath proper light, the Duke looked worse than she imagined. Fever flushed sharply beneath pale skin. Dark hair damp with sweat near his temples. Exhaustion carved brutally through every hard line of his face now that unconsciousness prevented him from hiding it behind control. He looked human for the first time. Fragile almost. Dangerous thing to witness. Elias shut the doors firmly behind the remaining servants before crossing toward her. You should not trust anyone in this house yet, he said quietly. I gathered that. The older man nodded once. Good. Rosalind looked toward the medical supplies already arranged beside the bed. Tell me the truth. Elias remained silent. How long has this been happening? His weathered face hardened slightly. Since autumn. The coughing. Worse every month. And the wound. 3 days ago. Elias glanced toward the unconscious Duke before lowering his voice further. Someone attacked His Grace returning from council meetings in Greyhaven. Rosalind's stomach tightened. And nobody found the attacker. No, convenient. Elias looked at her carefully then. You learn quickly. No, Rosalind said softly. I simply listen when people tell me they are being murdered. Silence stretched between them briefly. Then Elias stepped closer to the bedside and carefully unbuttoned the ruined black coat, still soaked with blood and melted snow. Rosalind inhaled sharply when she finally saw the wound fully exposed beneath the torn shirt and stained bandages. Angry redness spread outward from the knife wound beneath his ribs. Fever heat radiated visibly from his skin. Worse than before. Much worse. God! Elias looked grim. Dr. Pembroke insisted the infection was unavoidable. Rosalind stared down at the inflamed wound. No, her voice turned colder. This was neglected. She carefully removed the old bandages while Elias steadied the lantern closer beside her. The smell of infection hit immediately. Subtle, but unmistakable. "He has been given something," she whispered. "Not enough to kill quickly. Enough to weaken him slowly." Elias closed his eyes briefly like a man hearing confirmation of a nightmare already suspected. "Can you save him?" Rosalind froze slightly at the question. Save him? Nobody had ever asked her to save anything important before. She looked down at the unconscious Duke lying motionless beneath flickering firelight. The man who married her to protect her. The man everyone else seemed quietly prepared to bury. "I do not know," she admitted honestly. "But I can try." Elias nodded once immediately. "That is already more than the others have done." Hours passed slowly afterward beneath storm-dark silence. Rosalind cleaned the wound carefully with whiskey while Ashbourne drifted feverish and unconscious against the pillows. Twice his body tensed hard beneath her hands from pain even asleep. Yet he never fully woke. Never complained. Elias remained near the fire sharpening a knife absent-mindedly while keeping watch toward the doors. "You trust him," Rosalind said quietly at one point without looking up. Elias glanced toward the bed. "I raised him." Surprise flickered through her. "You did." "His father died when he was 11. Something softened briefly across the older man's rough features. The old Duke trusted nobody except books and horses. So the boy learned loneliness early. Rosalind changed the bandages carefully. "He does not seem lonely." Elias laughed once under his breath. "That is because he became dangerous instead." The fire crackled softly between them. Rosalind studied the unconscious man beside her again. Even feverish and weak, Thaddeus Ashbourne carried terrifying presence naturally. She could only imagine what years of betrayal inside this house had shaped him into. "Vivian is his sister?" Elias nodded. "Half-sister. And Lucien? Cousin. Who inherits if the Duke dies?" Silence. Then Elias answered quietly. "Vivian controls the estate temporarily until succession transfers legally through the Ashbourne bloodline." Rosalind's hands slowed slightly against the clean bandages. "But now he has a wife." Exactly. The meaning settled coldly into place. The marriage changed everything. Not emotionally, politically, legally, dangerously. Rosalind looked down at her platinum wedding ring glinting faintly beside the Duke's blood against her fingers. No wonder they looked at her like a problem. She was one. Near dawn, Ashbourne finally stirred weakly against the pillows. Rosalind looked up immediately from the chair beside his bed. Fever glazed his eyes unfocused beneath heavy exhaustion. "Easy," she whispered softly. His gaze drifted slowly across the room before finally finding her beside the bedside lantern. Recognition flickered faintly there. "You stayed." The words sounded rough from fever and pain. Rosalind almost smiled despite the fear still tightening through her chest. "You ordered me not to let them near you." Something faintly amused touched his expression before another harsh cough interrupted him. Rosalind steadied him carefully while he struggled for breath. Blood stained the cloth she pressed gently into his hand afterward. Less than before, but still enough to frighten her. Ashbourne noticed immediately. "Do not look at me like that." "Like what?" "Like I am already dead." The bluntness hurt unexpectedly. Rosalind met his eyes steadily. "You are not dead." No, his breathing roughened slightly again. "Just inconveniently difficult to kill." Even exhausted, he still found dark humor somewhere. She adjusted the fresh blankets around him carefully. "You need rest. I need names." His voice hardened faintly despite weakness. "Who entered this room while I was unconscious?" Rosalind blinked in surprise. "Nobody except Elias." Ashbourne relaxed slightly at that. Tiny change, but visible. "Good." Silence settled softly afterward while snow drifted endlessly against the dark windows. The Duke watched her quietly now through fever-heavy eyes. Why are you helping me? Rosalind looked down at the blood-stained cloth still folded in her hands. Because everyone else here seems invested in your funeral. Something unreadable moved behind his gaze at that. You should hate me. Why? I dragged you into this. Rosalind thought suddenly of Evercott House collapsing quietly beneath debt and humiliation. Of Aunt Lenora selling her future like property. Of Lucian smiling beside the storm road hoping the Duke would die before reaching home. No, she said softly. I think you pulled me out of something worse. Ashbourne stared at her silently after that. The firelight caught silver faintly threaded through his dark hair while exhaustion softened some of the severity from his face. Rosalind. The way he said her name now felt different somehow. Lower, careful, dangerous in entirely new ways. Before she could answer, a sudden sound echoed sharply through the corridor outside. Footsteps. Running. Elias stood instantly from beside the fire with one hand already on his knife. Then came shouting somewhere deeper inside the manor. A servant screaming. Rosalind rose quickly from the bedside. What happened? Elias crossed toward the door immediately. Stay here. But before he could reach the handle, the eastern hallway exploded suddenly with smoke. Thick black smoke pouring violently beneath the doorway from somewhere nearby. Rosalind's heart stopped cold. Fire. Elias cursed sharply under his breath and yanked the doors open. Smoke rolled instantly into the room while frightened servants shouted through the corridor outside. Then one terrified maid stumbled through the haze crying hard enough to barely speak. The Duchess's rooms, she gasped desperately. Someone set fire to the Duchess's rooms. Smoke swallowed the eastern corridor in thick rolling waves while servants rushed frantically through the manor carrying buckets of water and armfuls of blankets. The terrified maid still stood trembling in the doorway gasping for breath. The Duchess's chambers, she repeated weakly. The fire spread through the curtains. Rosalind felt cold shock move through her body instantly. She had not even seen the rooms yet. Someone already tried to burn them. Elias moved fast. Seal the western stairwell, he barked toward the servants outside. Nobody enters or leaves this wing without my permission. The older man turned sharply toward Rosalind afterward. Stay here. No, Elias looked ready to argue until another rough cough tore suddenly through the room behind them. Rosalind turned immediately toward the bed. Thaddeus Ashbourne had pushed himself halfway upright despite the fever consuming him. One hand braced hard against the mattress while blood stained the cloth pressed against his mouth again. Yet his eyes looked terrifyingly clear now. Alive in dangerous ways. Who ordered the rooms prepared? He asked coldly. The frightened maid swallowed hard. Mrs. Vivian, your grace. Silence hit the room sharply. Ashbourne closed his eyes briefly like a man hearing confirmation of something expected but still exhausting. Of course. Rosalind moved instinctively toward him. You should not be sitting up. And you should not be nearly burned alive on your wedding night. His voice roughened from pain and fever, but the cold authority beneath it remained intact. Elias crossed toward the bed quickly. Sir, let me handle this. No, Ashbourne swung his legs slowly toward the edge of the mattress. The movement visibly cost him. If someone set fire to my wife's rooms, they were not aiming at furniture. Wife. The word still startled Rosalind every time he used it. Not because it sounded possessive, because somehow he made it sound protective instead. Elias cursed softly under his breath. You can barely stand. Then I shall intimidate them sitting down. Despite the fear tightening the room, Rosalind almost smiled again. The Duke looked toward her then. Really looked at her. Firelight flickered across the fever-bright intensity in his eyes. Did you breathe much smoke? No. Are you hurt? The question landed strangely gentle beneath all the coldness surrounding it. Rosalind shook her head once. I am fine. Ashbourne relaxed fractionally at that before another wave of exhaustion visibly struck him. His hand tightened hard against the edge of the bed. Rosalind stepped beside him immediately. Enough. Rosalind. No, she lowered her voice carefully. You nearly collapsed an hour ago. An hour ago I was not informed someone tried to burn my Duchess alive. Something shifted sharply through the room after those words. Even Elias went still briefly. My Duchess. Not political. Not formal. Personal. Ashbourne realized it too late. The silence afterward thickened instantly. Rosalind looked at him in surprise while the Duke stared back at her with something unreadable moving behind his exhaustion. Then the moment vanished beneath another brutal cough. Blood spotted the white linen sheets this time. Fear sliced sharply through her chest. "Lie back down," she whispered. "That sounds suspiciously like an order." "It is." Unexpectedly, something faintly amused flickered across his face despite the fever. "You adapt to power quickly. I adapt to survival." Ashbourne watched her another long second before finally allowing Elias to help him back against the pillows. The victory felt fragile, temporary, like forcing winter storms to kneel. Outside the corridor remained chaos. Smoke drifted beneath the doorway while servants shouted distantly through the manor halls. Rosalind crossed toward the fire and dipped a cloth carefully into cool water before returning to the bedside. "Where are the burned rooms located?" she asked quietly while pressing the cloth gently against Ashbourne's fever-hot forehead. The Duke closed his eyes briefly beneath the touch. "Adjacent to these chambers." "Convenient." "Yes." Elias folded his arms near the doorway. "The eastern wing is heavily guarded. Fires do not start accidentally there." Rosalind looked toward him sharply. "Then how?" "Someone either paid a servant or entered privately." "Vivian?" Elias hesitated. Ashbourne answered instead. "My sister prefers cleaner methods." Rosalind thought immediately of poison medicine, infected wounds, smiling relatives waiting for funerals. "Then who?" The Duke opened his eyes slowly again. "That is the problem with wealthy families." His voice turned colder. "The suspect list becomes exhausting." A sudden knock struck sharply against the bedroom doors before anyone could respond. Elias moved instantly toward his knife. "Who is it?" "Vivian," came the calm reply through the wood. Rosalind felt tension tighten immediately through the room. Ashbourne looked exhausted suddenly. "Not physically. Emotionally." "Of course it is." Elias cracked the door carefully while smoke still drifted through the corridor behind him. Vivian entered moments later untouched by the chaos surrounding the manor. Her navy silk remained immaculate. Not a strand of dark hair out of place. Rosalind distrusted her instantly for that alone. "The fire has been contained," Vivian announced smoothly. Her pale gray eyes shifted immediately toward the Duke propped weakly against the bed. "You look worse. You look disappointed." Vivian ignored the remark and instead turned toward Rosalind. "Your chambers are unusable now, unfortunately." "How tragic," Rosalind replied softly. Something dangerous flickered behind Vivian's expression then. Interest again. "You are sharper than I expected. You are less subtle than you believe." Elias nearly choked, trying not to laugh openly behind them. Vivian's gaze moved back toward the bed. "Thaddeus, you need proper medical treatment." "I already have it." The Duke's eyes shifted briefly toward Rosalind. Vivian followed the glance immediately. "Her?" "Yes. A girl with no medical training." Ashbourne's voice turned deadly quiet. "And yet somehow she has poisoned me less than your physician." Silence crashed across the room instantly. Vivian's expression finally hardened openly. "Careful." "No," the Duke coughed roughly into his hand before continuing anyway. "I have spent months being careful." Blood stained his fingers again. Rosalind moved toward him instinctively with fresh cloth before he could hide it. Vivian watched the movement closely. Very closely. "Interesting," she murmured softly. "You trust her already." Ashbourne looked toward Rosalind instead of his sister. "More than most people sharing my blood." The words settled heavily through the room. Vivian went completely still after that. Not wounded. Calculating. Like a chess player adjusting strategy mid-game. Rosalind suddenly understood something terrifying. These people did not speak emotionally. Every sentence inside this family carried hidden weapons beneath it. Vivian approached the bedside slowly afterward. "Then perhaps you should know what your loyal little bride found in her burned chambers." She withdrew something small from inside her coat pocket and dropped it carefully onto the bedside table beside Rosalind. Silver gleamed beneath the firelight. The small key hidden beneath Rosalind's skirts suddenly felt ice-cold against her skin, because the object on the table was identical. Same shape, same worn silver edges. Same carved marking near the top. Ashbourne's expression changed instantly. Real shock. Where did you get that? Vivian folded her gloved hands together elegantly. Inside the Duchess's room after the fire. Rosalind felt her heartbeat stumble painfully once. Impossible. Her own key still remained hidden in her dress pocket. Unless there were two. Ashbourne picked up the silver key slowly with blood-stained fingers. Fever and exhaustion vanished from his expression beneath something much darker now. Who entered those rooms first? Vivian's pale eyes moved briefly toward Rosalind before returning to her brother. Dr. Pembroke. Silence. Then Ashbourne laughed softly. Not humor. Recognition. Dangerous recognition. Of course. Rosalind stared at the silver key resting against the Duke's hand. What does it open? The room went still. Even Elias looked suddenly uncomfortable. Ashbourne's jaw tightened visibly before he answered. The West Wing. Fear curled slowly through Rosalind's stomach. The locked wing. The forbidden section of the manor. The place nobody mentioned openly. Vivian watched her carefully now. How curious, she murmured. Someone seems very determined to keep the new Duchess away from it. Rosalind looked sharply toward her. Why? Vivian smiled faintly, beautiful and cold as broken glass. Because, she said softly, that is where the first Duchess died. Silence swallowed the room whole afterward. Fire crackled softly against stone walls while snow battered the windows outside. Rosalind felt the hidden key beneath her skirts burning against her skin now. 2 keys. 2 secrets. And somewhere inside the locked western wing of Ashbourne Manor waited the truth everyone seemed willing to kill protecting. The room remained silent long after Vivian spoke the words. That is where the first Duchess died. Firelight flickered softly across the silver key resting in Thaddeus Ashbourne's blood-stained hand while snow battered the windows hard enough to shake the glass. Rosalind could feel the second hidden key burning against her skin beneath the folds of her gown like a living thing now. Ashbourne looked more exhausted than angry suddenly, as though old ghosts weighed heavier than fresh betrayal. Vivian watched him carefully across the room. You should have destroyed that wing years ago, she said quietly. I should have destroyed several things years ago. His voice turned rough beneath exhaustion. Unfortunately, I was too busy surviving. Rosalind looked between them slowly. What happened to the first Duchess? Silence crashed down instantly again. Elias shifted uncomfortably near the door. Vivian's expression smoothed into dangerous calm. Only Ashbourne continued staring at the silver key in his hand. She fell, Vivian said finally, from the west balcony. Rosalind felt cold move slowly down her spine. And people believe that? People believe whatever protects powerful families from scandal. The bluntness startled her. Vivian looked toward the fire thoughtfully. Officially, it was called an accident. Unofficially, Rosalind asked softly. Ashbourne answered instead. Unofficially, the rumors changed depending on who wanted something. His eyes lifted toward hers then. Fever still burned through him visibly, but something darker moved beneath it now. Memory, perhaps. Some believed she jumped. Vivian folded her hands together. Others believed she was pushed. The room felt suddenly colder despite the fire. Rosalind looked back toward the silver key resting near the bedside. And the west wing stayed locked afterward. By Thaddeus's orders, Vivian said calmly. No servants permitted. No guests. No discussion. Her pale eyes sharpened slightly. Yet somehow tonight 2 identical keys appear after someone attempts to burn your rooms. Elias swore softly under his breath. Ashbourne leaned back harder against the pillows with visible fatigue overtaking him again piece by piece. Enough, he muttered quietly. Not tonight. Vivian studied him for a long second before nodding once. Very well. She turned toward Rosalind afterward. A word of advice, Duchess. Rosalind met her gaze steadily. Do not confuse surviving this house with understanding it. Then Vivian left without another word. The heavy doors closed behind her softly. Silence returned immediately afterward. Only the storm remained, and the exhausted Duke breathing unevenly against white linen sheets. Elias moved first. He crossed toward the bedside and lowered his voice carefully. You should sleep, sir. Ashbourne laughed once under his breath. Sleep appears increasingly dangerous around here. Another rough cough interrupted him. Rosalind handed him a clean cloth automatically before he could reach for one himself. Their fingers brushed briefly. Fever heat radiated sharply through his skin now. Worse than before. Ashbourne noticed the concern crossing her face immediately. Do not look frightened. You are coughing blood every 20 minutes. Less than yesterday. Rosalind stared at him in disbelief. That is supposed to comfort me? Something faintly amused touched his tired expression again. You sound personally offended by my decline. Perhaps I am. The words escaped before she could soften them. Silence followed instantly. Ashbourne looked at her differently after that. More carefully somehow. Then another wave of exhaustion visibly struck him. His breathing roughened slightly while one hand pressed unconsciously against the wound beneath his ribs. Rosalind moved beside the bed immediately. You need medicine. Not from Pembroke. I know. She reached toward the small tray of supplies beside the bed instead. I brought willow bark tea earlier. It may help the fever. Ashbourne watched her quietly while she poured the steaming liquid into a glass. You learned remedies from your mother? Rosalind nodded once. Before she died. How old were you? 14. Something flickered briefly behind his eyes then. Sympathy perhaps. Dangerous thing coming from a man like him. She helped him sit up carefully against the pillows while Elias quietly extinguished several unnecessary candles around the room. The manor beyond the heavy doors had finally grown quieter now. Distant footsteps, wind, crackling fire, shadows. Ashbourne accepted the tea from her hands but paused before drinking. Rosalind. Yes. If anything happens tonight. Her heartbeat tightened immediately. Do not. Listen to me. His voice sharpened despite exhaustion. If I stop breathing before morning, Elias takes you south immediately. No. This is not negotiable. Neither is your survival. Their eyes locked hard across the firelit room. Ashbourne looked startled for one brief second. Not by defiance itself. By the emotion behind it. Rosalind realized suddenly how rarely people probably fought to keep him alive instead of waiting politely for him to die. Elias cleared his throat quietly near the fireplace. The Duchess is correct, sir. You are both becoming irritatingly loyal. You married her, Elias muttered. This feels partly your fault. Against all reason, Rosalind laughed softly. Real laughter this time. The sound startled the room into brief stillness afterward. Ashbourne looked toward her immediately. Not cold. Not guarded. Just watching. There, he murmured quietly. You do remember how. Rosalind frowned faintly. How what? How to sound alive. The words hit deeper than they should have. Before she could answer, a sudden knock sounded sharply against the doors again. Elias moved instantly toward the handle with visible irritation. If this is another attempted murder, they are becoming repetitive. He opened the door carefully. A young maid stood trembling outside carrying folded linens and fresh candles. Forgive me, she whispered nervously. Mrs. Vivian requested these for the Duchess. Elias checked the items carefully before allowing her inside. The maid crossed toward Rosalind quickly with lowered eyes. Your Grace. Rosalind accepted the folded linens politely. Thank you. The girl hesitated strangely afterward instead of leaving immediately. Fear flickered visibly across her face. What is it? Rosalind asked softly. The maid swallowed hard. I should not speak. Elias stepped closer instantly. Then why are you still standing here? The girl's eyes shifted nervously toward the Duke lying pale against the pillows. Because, she whispered shakily, someone should tell you before the household does. Ashbourne's expression hardened immediately. Tell us what? The maid twisted her hands together tightly. The servants believe the first Duchess did not fall. Silence. The girl looked close to tears now. They say she was trying to leave the West Wing when she died. Rosalind felt cold settle hard through her chest. Leave. The maid nodded weakly. There are stories. Her voice dropped almost to nothing. People heard screaming the night she died. Elias looked furious suddenly. Enough. But the girl continued anyway like fear had finally broken open inside her after too many years of silence. She kept journals. she whispered desperately. The first Duchess wrote everything down. Ashbourne went completely still against the pillows. What journals? The maid looked terrified now. Nobody knows where they are. Rosalind's hand moved unconsciously toward the hidden silver key beneath her skirts. The maid noticed nothing. She lowered her voice even further. But before she died, the Duchess told one servant something strange. Ashbourne's eyes sharpened dangerously. What? The girl looked directly at Rosalind then. She said if anything happened to her, the next Duchess must never trust the West Wing after dark. Silence swallowed the room whole afterward. The fire cracked softly. Wind clawed against the windows. Somewhere far below in the endless corridors of Ashbourne Manor, a grandfather clock began striking 3 in the morning. One slow chime after another. The maid finally hurried from the room, trembling hard enough to nearly drop the remaining candles. Elias shut the doors heavily behind her before turning back toward the bed. Servants invent stories. But nobody truly believed that. Rosalind could see it immediately. Ashbourne stared toward the fire now with an expression colder than anything she had witnessed yet. Not fear. Rage held carefully beneath exhaustion. "Thaddeus," she whispered carefully. His gaze shifted slowly toward her. "Did your first wife keep journals?" Long silence. Then finally the Duke answered quietly. "Yes." Rosalind's pulse stumbled once. "Where are they?" The firelight flickered sharply across his exhausted face while snowstorm shadows moved endlessly behind the windows. "That," he said softly, "is exactly what someone inside this house has been trying to keep hidden." The storm finally weakened near dawn, but Ashbourne Manor only seemed darker without the sound of wind drowning its secrets. Pale gray morning light filtered weakly through the eastern windows while Rosalind sat beside the Duke's bed with the hidden silver key curled tightly in her hand beneath the blanket. She had not slept. Neither had Thaddeus Ashbourne. Fever kept dragging him in and out of restless silence while the fire burned low beside them. Elias remained near the door, keeping watch with the stillness of a soldier expecting enemies before sunrise. Somewhere deep inside the manor, servants had already begun whispering about the burned chambers, the locked West Wing, and the dead first Duchess whose journals had vanished years ago. Rosalind could feel the secrets pressing against the walls around them now. Heavy. Waiting. Ashbourne opened his eyes slowly just after dawn. For several seconds, he looked disoriented beneath exhaustion before his gaze found her immediately beside the bed. It always found her now. "You are still here," he murmured roughly. Rosalind almost smiled despite the fear lodged constantly beneath her ribs. "You sound surprised every time. I spent too many years around people who leave." The honesty inside the statement hit harder than he probably intended. Ashbourne realized it immediately and looked away toward the fire. Walls returning piece by piece. Rosalind studied him carefully in the dim morning light. Fever still burned through him, although less violently than before. The fresh bandages around his ribs remained clean for now. Progress. Fragile progress. "How do you feel?" she asked quietly. "Like death lost patience and decided to linger." Elias snorted softly near the doorway. "Good. Sarcasm means you are alive." Ashbourne looked toward the older man with faint irritation. "You have become unbearably optimistic." Rosalind poured fresh tea slowly into a porcelain cup before handing it carefully toward him. "Drink." The Duke accepted it without argument this time. Another dangerous sign. Men like Thaddeus Ashbourne probably only obeyed when exhaustion stripped away the energy required for resistance. "Tell me about the journals," Rosalind said softly once he finished drinking. Silence settled instantly across the room. Ashbourne rested the empty cup carefully against the bedside table before answering. "Her name was Eleanor." Something shifted in his expression when he spoke the name. Not love exactly. Memory perhaps. Regret. She hated this house from the beginning. Rosalind listened quietly while pale morning light spread slowly across the room. "Did you love her?" The question escaped before she could stop it. Elias looked suddenly interested in the curtains. Ashbourne remained silent long enough that she regretted asking. Then finally he answered. "I respected her." Something about the wording hurt unexpectedly, because it sounded like the kindest truth he could offer. "She kept journals from the day she arrived here," he continued quietly. "At first they were harmless. observations, sketches, complaints about weather and dinners. His eyes darkened slightly. Then she started writing about things she noticed inside the manor. Rosalind's fingers tightened subtly around the blanket. What things? Conversations stopping when she entered rooms. Servants disappearing unexpectedly. Locked doors. He looked toward the fire again. Fear. Silence stretched heavily afterward. And then she died, Rosalind whispered. Ashbourne's jaw tightened visibly. Yes. Did you believe she jumped? The question lingered dangerously between them. Elias shifted uneasily near the door. But the Duke answered anyway. No, one word. Absolute. Rosalind felt cold move slowly through her chest. Then why was it called an accident? A humorless shadow crossed his face. Because powerful families do not survive public scandal by telling the truth. Before Rosalind could answer, a sharp knock interrupted the room. Elias moved immediately toward the door with visible irritation already darkening his expression. What now? One of the younger footmen bowed nervously from the corridor outside. Forgive me, sir. Mrs. Vivian requests the family attend breakfast. Ashbourne stared at the servant in disbelief. I am bleeding internally. Yes, sir. And someone attempted to burn my wife alive 6 hours ago. Yes, sir. Yet my sister wants breakfast. The footman swallowed hard. Yes, sir. Silence. Then unexpectedly, Rosalind laughed softly into her hand. Real laughter again. Tired but genuine. Ashbourne looked toward her immediately with something dangerously close to warmth flickering behind his exhaustion. You find this amusing? Slightly. That concerns me. Even Elias almost smiled at that. The Duke sighed quietly afterward and pushed the blankets aside despite Rosalind instantly frowning beside him. Absolutely not. Rosalind. You can barely stand. Which means I should arrive before the vultures begin dividing my belongings publicly. He attempted to rise from the bed. Halfway through the movement, pain hit him visibly hard enough to steal the color from his face. Rosalind caught his arm immediately before he could fall backward again. Enough! Ashbourne looked down at her hand gripping his sleeve, then slowly up into her eyes. Something quiet passed between them, something more dangerous than fear now. Trust. Help me, he said softly. Not command. Request. Rosalind swallowed once before nodding. Together she and Elias helped him dress slowly in fresh black clothing, while morning spread fully across the manor beyond the windows. Every movement clearly hurt him. Yet Ashbourne endured the pain with terrifying silence. No complaint. No weakness visible except the occasional tightening near his eyes when the wound pulled beneath the bandages. Rosalind adjusted the collar of his dark coat carefully once he finally stood upright beside the bed. You should still rest. I will, he replied dryly. After surviving breakfast. The family dining hall looked exactly like a room built by people who preferred power over happiness. Massive dark table. Towering windows. Silver polished bright enough to reflect candlelight like knives. Portraits of dead Ashbournes watching from the walls with expressions ranging from judgment to boredom. Vivian already sat at one end of the table wearing pale gray silk this morning. Lucian lounged beside the fireplace with effortless elegance while Dr. Pembroke pretended fascination with the morning newspaper near the windows. Every conversation stopped the moment Thaddeus entered beside Rosalind. The silence felt immediate, sharp. Lucian recovered first. Well, he drawled softly. The dead return surprisingly often in this family. Ashbourne lowered himself slowly into the chair at the head of the table without taking his eyes off his cousin. Disappointing, is it? Lucian smiled faintly. Only inconvenient. Vivian's pale gaze shifted toward Rosalind instead. You survived the fire. Barely, Rosalind replied calmly. Someone seemed determined otherwise. Dr. Pembroke nearly dropped his teacup. Tiny reaction, but enough. Ashbourne noticed immediately. So did Rosalind. The Duke leaned back slightly despite exhaustion carving shadows beneath his eyes. Interesting thing about attempted murder, he murmured quietly. It tends to make breakfast conversations more honest. Nobody smiled. Servants moved nervously around the table pouring coffee and arranging silver trays while tension thickened beneath every breath. Lucian finally looked toward Rosalind directly. You are adapting quickly to Ashbourne Manor. Survival encourages efficiency. Careful. Lucien's smile sharpened faintly. People disappear here for speaking too freely. Before Rosalind could answer, Ashbourne's voice cut cleanly across the table. Threaten my wife again, and I will bury you somewhere so remote even God struggles to locate you. Silence crashed through the dining hall instantly. Servants froze. Dr. Pembroke went pale. Vivian looked almost interested again. Rosalind stared toward the Duke in genuine shock. Not because of the threat itself, because he sounded completely sincere. Lucien recovered first with a soft laugh beneath the tension. There he is. Who? Ashbourne asked coldly. The man who finally found something worth surviving for. The room went dead silent after that. Rosalind felt her heartbeat stumble painfully once. Across the table, Ashbourne's expression did not move at all. Yet something dangerous flashed briefly behind his eyes before vanishing beneath cold restraint again. Lucien noticed it. Vivian noticed it. Everyone noticed it. That terrified Rosalind more than the threats. Because suddenly she understood something none of them had expected. The Duke was no longer fighting only for himself anymore. Breakfast ended quickly afterward. Too much tension. Too many secrets breathing beneath polished silver and polite conversation. Rosalind followed Ashbourne slowly through the corridor afterward while servants disappeared nervously around them. The Duke looked exhausted again now that the confrontation ended. You should not have come downstairs, she whispered once they reached the empty eastern hallway. Probably not. You are feverish. Probably. Rosalind stopped walking suddenly and caught his sleeve before he could continue farther. Why did you say that? Ashbourne looked down at her carefully. Say what? That you would bury Lucien for threatening me. Something shifted quietly behind his tired eyes then. Not hesitation. Realization, perhaps. Like he had stopped noticing how instinctively protective he became around her. Because, he said softly, I am very tired of people trying to hurt what belongs to me. The words settled hard between them. Rosalind stopped breathing briefly. Belongs to me. Dangerous words from a dangerous man. Before either could speak again, a scream suddenly echoed sharply through the manor from somewhere above them. Female. Terrified. Ashbourne straightened instantly despite visible pain ripping through him. Servants began shouting through the upper corridors. Then a maid came running toward them white with panic. Your Grace. She could barely breathe. Someone broke into the west wing. The entire manor seemed to freeze after the maid spoke. Someone broke into the west wing. Silence crashed through the eastern hallway while servants gathered nervously at the far staircase whispering beneath their breath. Rosalind felt the hidden silver key press cold against her palm inside her sleeve. Beside her, Thaddeus Ashbourne went completely still. More frightening than anger. The Duke's face emptied of every visible emotion until only something dark and ancient remained beneath his eyes. Who entered? He asked quietly. The maid trembled harder. Nobody knows, Your Grace. Mrs. Vivian ordered the doors sealed after the servants heard glass breaking upstairs. Elias appeared at the end of the corridor moments later, already armed and visibly furious. The west stairwell was locked from the inside, he said sharply. Someone had a key. Rosalind's pulse stumbled once painfully. Ashbourne looked toward her immediately. Not suspicion. Recognition. He knew. Slowly, carefully, Rosalind slipped the hidden silver key from her sleeve and placed it into his hand. Elias stared at it in shock. Where did you get that? One of the Duke's men gave it to me after the wedding, Rosalind admitted quietly. He told me to run if His Grace died. Ashbourne closed his fingers around the key tightly. Exhaustion still hollowed his face, but something else burned through him now stronger than fever. Determination. Take me upstairs. Elias looked horrified. Absolutely not. Elias. You can barely breathe. And yet somehow everyone still expects me to die politely in bed while they destroy evidence. Another harsh cough tore through him immediately afterward. Blood stained the edge of his glove again. Rosalind stepped closer instinctively. You are not walking across this manor alone. The Duke looked at her then. Really looked at her. Something softened briefly behind all the coldness before disappearing again beneath restraint. That, he murmured softly, is becoming a dangerous habit. Together they climbed toward the west wing while the manor watched in silence. Servants flattened themselves against corridor walls as the Duke passed. Nobody spoke. Nobody breathed too loudly. Fear moved through Ashbourne Manor like smoke now. The western staircase curved upward into darkness untouched by warmth or candlelight. Dust coated the banisters. Thick velvet curtains remained permanently drawn across the tall windows. The entire wing smelled faintly of old wood and forgotten winters. Rosalind felt it immediately. Grief lived here still. Vivian waited outside the locked entrance doors when they arrived. Lucian stood beside her near the corridor shadows while Dr. Pembroke lingered several feet behind them looking deeply uncomfortable. "Well?" Vivian said softly when she saw the silver key in her brother's hand. "It appears the dead left invitations after all." Ashbourne ignored her completely and moved toward the massive black doors at the end of the corridor. Every step visibly cost him now. Rosalind stayed close enough to catch him if necessary. The doors themselves looked enormous beneath layers of dust and iron locks. One of the locks hung broken already, freshly shattered. Elias cursed quietly. "Someone got inside before us." Ashbourne slid the silver key slowly into the remaining lock. For one suspended second nobody moved. Then the mechanism clicked open with a sound like old bones shifting beneath earth. The doors creaked inward. Darkness waited beyond them, cold, silent, untouched for years. Elias lit a lantern first before anyone entered. Firelight rolled slowly across the abandoned corridor inside, revealing long white sheets draped over furniture like ghosts. Dust swirled through the air beneath their footsteps. Portraits lined the walls beneath faded wallpaper. Women with pale Ashbourne eyes staring silently from gold frames. Rosalind felt the strange pressure of the place immediately. Not haunted, remembered. Ashbourne walked forward slowly despite Elias repeatedly warning him to stop. "The Duchess's rooms were at the far end," he said quietly. "Nobody enters without my permission." Lucian glanced around with faint amusement. "You always did enjoy dramatic architecture. You always did enjoy hearing yourself speak." Vivian moved silently through the corridor, studying the rooms carefully while servants remained clustered nervously near the entrance, unwilling to come farther inside. Then suddenly Rosalind saw it. One door standing partially open near the end of the hall. Fresh footprints cutting through the dust toward it. "There," she whispered. Everyone turned instantly. Ashbourne's expression hardened dangerously. Together they crossed the corridor slowly, while the lantern light flickered across old walls and forgotten portraits. The partially open room beyond looked enormous. A private sitting chamber once elegant beneath layers of neglect. Broken glass glittered across the floor near shattered balcony doors. Wind howled softly through torn curtains. Someone had searched this room recently. Violently. Drawers ripped open. Books scattered. Furniture overturned. Elias swore softly beneath his breath. They were looking for something. Ashbourne moved farther inside slowly until sudden dizziness visibly struck him again. Rosalind caught his arm immediately before he collapsed. His skin burned hot beneath her fingers now. Fever worsening rapidly again. Yet his eyes remained fixed on the far wall. "The desk," he whispered. Rosalind followed his gaze. An old writing desk stood half overturned beside the fireplace. One hidden compartment near the bottom hung open. Empty. Ashbourne closed his eyes briefly. "Damn it." Vivian stepped closer slowly. "The journals." Lucian looked genuinely interested now. So they did exist. Rosalind crossed carefully toward the desk while wind whipped icy air through the broken balcony doors. Something glinted faintly beneath the overturned chair nearby. She bent slowly and picked it up. A single torn page, yellowed with age. Ink smeared slightly by time but still readable. "Wait," she whispered. Everyone looked toward her instantly. The page trembled slightly between her fingers while she read aloud beneath the lantern light. "If anything happens to me, it was not an accident." Silence crashed violently through the room. Vivian's face went pale for the first time since Rosalind met her. Lucian stopped smiling entirely. Even Dr. Pembroke looked suddenly frightened. Rosalind continued reading quietly while the storm rattled the shattered balcony doors behind her. The poison began slowly, small enough to appear like illness. Her voice faltered. "Thaddeus does not see it yet, But someone inside this house wants the Ashbourne line buried. Ashbourne stared at the page like a man watching ghosts rise from graves. Rosalind lifted her eyes slowly toward him. She knew. The Duke looked exhausted suddenly in a way deeper than physical pain. Old grief moved visibly beneath his composure now. Yes, he said softly. She tried to tell me before she died. Lucian stepped backward slightly. This proves nothing. No. Vivian turned sharply toward him. It proves someone has been poisoning Ashbourne dukes for years. Dr. Pembroke looked ready to collapse entirely now. Sweat glistened visibly along his forehead despite the freezing room. Elias noticed immediately. So did Ashbourne. The Duke turned slowly toward the physician. Interesting reaction, Doctor. Pembroke swallowed hard. Your Grace, this is absurd. Is it? Ashbourne took one dangerous step closer despite visibly struggling to remain upright. My wife finds a page accusing poison. My first Duchess dies mysteriously. My current physician prescribes medicine that worsens my condition. His voice lowered almost to nothing. You should be more convincing when pretending innocence. Pembroke panicked then. Tiny movement, barely visible. His hand shifted instinctively toward his coat pocket. Elias moved instantly and slammed the physician hard against the wall before he could reach inside it. A small glass vial shattered across the floor seconds later. Thick dark liquid spread slowly through the dust. The entire room froze. Vivian stared at the broken vial in horror. Lucian's face drained completely of color. Elias held Pembroke against the wall with murderous fury. What is this? The physician began shaking violently. I had no choice. Ashbourne went utterly still. Who ordered it? Pembroke's eyes darted wildly across the room. Fear consumed him openly now. They said they would ruin my family. Who? Ashbourne's voice cracked like ice breaking. The physician looked straight toward Lucian. Silence detonated through the west wing. Lucian stepped backward instantly. Careful. Vivian looked at him in disbelief. Oh my God. Lucian's composure finally cracked apart completely. He was dying already. You poisoned him, Rosalind whispered. Slowly, Lucian snapped sharply. Quietly. It was supposed to look natural. Rage unlike anything Rosalind had ever witnessed darkened Ashbourne's face completely then. Not loud. Worse. Cold enough to terrify everyone in the room. Lucian saw it too late. Thaddeus. Get out. The words came soft as death itself. Lucian hesitated only 1 second before Elias drew his revolver. Run, the older man advised flatly. Lucian fled. Servants scattered screaming through the corridors as he disappeared into the manor shadows. Vivian remained frozen beside the broken desk staring toward the poison spreading across the dusty floorboards. All these years, she whispered faintly. Ashbourne swayed suddenly beside Rosalind. The fury sustaining him finally gave way beneath exhaustion and fever. Rosalind caught him immediately before he collapsed. His breathing turned rough against her shoulder while blood stained the front of his dark coat once more. Easy, she whispered desperately. The Duke looked down at her through fever-heavy eyes while the shattered west wing blurred around them. You stayed, he murmured softly again. Rosalind tightened her hold on him. Yes. Something fragile and exhausted and unbearably honest moved behind his gaze then. No one ever stayed before. The words nearly broke her heart. She helped him slowly toward the broken balcony where pale winter dawn now stretched across the frozen Ashbourne cliffs beyond the manor. Snow covered the world below in endless white silence. Behind them, secrets finally lay exposed inside the West Wing. Poison, betrayal, murder hidden behind wealth and family names. But none of it mattered quite as much suddenly as the man leaning weakly against her shoulder still fighting to remain alive. Ashbourne looked toward the sunrise slowly breaking across the snow-covered hills. Then back toward Rosalind standing beside him in the cold morning light. You asked once why I chose you, he said quietly. Rosalind nodded faintly. The Duke reached up slowly and touched her cheek with trembling fever-warm fingers. Gentle, reverent. Because, he whispered, even surrounded by cruelty, you never learned how to become cruel yourself. Tears burned unexpectedly behind her eyes. Ashbourne rested his forehead briefly against hers, while snow drifted softly through the broken balcony doors around them. "They sold you to save themselves," he murmured roughly. "But they were fools." Rosalind closed her eyes briefly against the emotion tightening painfully through her chest. The Duke's voice lowered further, barely above breath now. "Because the greatest gift they ever handed me," he whispered, "was you."